His name was Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, son of a Welsh squire and a French queen, half-brother to a troubled, saintly, ultimately tragic king, husband to one of the most determined and extraordinary women the medieval world ever produced, father of Henry VII, the first Tudor king of England. Tonight, here on Katherine, we are going to walk beside him from the very beginning, from long before Edmund himself was born, back to the moment when his existence first became possible, back to a secret kept in a candlelit room in a royal household, between a man who had no right to aim so high and a woman who had every reason to be more careful and who chose love anyway. Welcome, sleepy traveler. You have found Katherine, your quiet corner of forgotten history, your soft and shadowed place in the margins of the past. Tonight, we step into the long shadow of Henry VI, of Margaret Beaufort, of the Tudor dynasty itself, and we find Edmund there, waiting patiently in the half-light, waiting for someone to tell his story from the very beginning. Edmund's story is, at its heart, a story about what it means to live beside power without holding it. His father lived in the shadow of a royal household. Edmund himself lived in the shadow of a king who was his half-brother. His wife lived in the shadow of the child Edmund gave her, and the dynasty that Edmund's brief life made possible cast its shadow over England for generations. Shadow upon shadow upon shadow. And tonight, we will sit quietly in all of them and listen. This is a complete journey from beginning to end, told gently and slowly, perfect for drifting into peaceful dreams. Before we begin, dear friend, I would love your help in growing our little shadow community here at Katherine. A simple like on this video makes a genuine difference. It helps other lovers of forgotten history find us, in the quiet corners of the internet where stories like Edmund's are still being told. And please, leave a comment below telling me, do you think Edmund Tudor ever truly understood what his blood, that remarkable mixture of Welsh and royal, common and extraordinary, would one day mean for England? I read every single comment, and your thoughts genuinely brighten my day. If you have not subscribed yet, please consider joining us here in the shadows. We have so many more whispered stories waiting for you. Now, let's settle in. Pull the blanket a little closer. Let the room grow soft around you. And let us begin, as all good shadow stories must, at the very beginning. To understand Edmund Tudor, you must first understand where he came from. And to understand where he came from, you cannot begin with Edmund himself. You cannot even begin with his parents, quite yet. You must go further back than that. You must go back to a place and a people and a set of old, proud memories that shaped everything that came after. You must go to Wales. Close your eyes for a moment, or let them rest, half closed, as they may well be by now, and imagine a landscape quite different from the busy, managed, populated England of the medieval period. Imagine something wilder, something older. Imagine driving west from England across a border that is not just geographical but cultural, almost spiritual, a place where the language changes, where the hills grow steeper and more dramatic, where the rivers run colder and faster through valleys that seem carved by something older than human civilization. Imagine following that western road all the way to the coast, all the way to where the land gives out and the Irish Sea begins. And then, off the northwestern tip of the Welsh mainland, separated from it by a narrow, fast-running channel of cold grey water, imagine an island. This is Anglesey. In Welsh, it is called Ynys Môn, which means simply and plainly, the island. It is a green place, surprisingly flat compared to the dramatic mountains of mainland Wales that you can see across the Menai Strait. On clear days, those peaks of Snowdonia rising dark and jagged against the sky, their summits catching cloud and shadow, their valleys hidden and secretive in a way that has always seemed appropriate for a part of the world where secrets and ancient memory run very deep. Anglesey itself is fertile farmland, washed by the sea winds that come in off the Irish Sea carrying moisture and salt and the smell of something vast and ancient. It has been inhabited for thousands of years. There are standing stones on Anglesey older than the pyramids of Egypt. There are traces of Celtic settlements, of Roman roads, of layers and layers of human habitation going back into a past that the medieval Welsh people knew was there, even if they could not fully read it. This is where the Tudor family had their roots, where, in the opening years of the 15th century, around the year 1400, a boy was born whose name in Welsh was Owen ap Margaret ap Tudor. In English, this name gets compressed and anglicised. Owen becomes Owen, the patronymics fall away, and what remains is simply Owen Tudor. But the Welsh name matters, because it tells you something important. This was a Welsh family, rooted in Welsh identity, shaped by Welsh culture and Welsh history, and the particular pride of a people who knew they were ancient and who refused to forget it, even when the world around them insisted they should. Owen came from what the Welsh called a bonhedig family, a word that translates roughly as gentle or of free birth, meaning a family of standing and respectability in their community, though not great lords, not men with armies or vast estates. They were people of lineage, of recognized position, of a kind of inherited dignity that did not depend on great wealth because it was rooted in something older and, in Welsh reckoning, more fundamental: blood, ancestry, connection to the deep past of the Welsh people. And the Tudors of Anglesey had a lineage worth being proud of. They claimed descent, and this claim was taken seriously in Welsh society from a man named Edmund Tudor, who had served as the Disdain, the chief steward and principal advisor of Llywelyn IV, Llywelyn the Great. Llywelyn the Great was, in the historical memory of Wales, one of the most remarkable figures the Welsh nation ever produced. He had ruled in the early 13th century, and during his reign he had come closer than any Welsh leader, before or since, to uniting the various principalities of Wales under a single authority, to creating something that looked and functioned like a genuine Welsh state. He was a prince of extraordinary political intelligence and military capability, and Edmund Tudor had stood beside him, had managed his household, conducted his diplomacy, carried his decisions out into the world. To be descended from such a man was, in Welsh reckoning, something significant, something worth remembering across the generations. But Owen's immediate family, in the years of his childhood, were living in more modest circumstances than their illustrious ancestry might suggest. The early 15th century had been harsh for many Welsh families, and the reason why brings us to one of the most dramatic and painful chapters in Welsh history, the Glyndŵr Rebellion. In 1400, the very year Owen was likely born, a Welsh nobleman named Owen Glyndŵr, whose name translates as something like Owen of the Glyndifrydwy Valley, a poetically beautiful name for a man who became something of a legend, raised the standard of Welsh independence. He did not do this lightly or rashly. He was an educated man, trained in English law, connected to the old Welsh aristocracy, and deeply conscious of the accumulated grievances that Welsh people had been carrying for years. The English administration of Wales was often harsh and discriminatory. Welsh people faced legal disabilities that English people did not. Welsh land had been taken. Welsh dignity had been repeatedly slighted by an English government that viewed Wales as a conquered territory rather than a partner. Glyndŵr articulated these grievances and transformed them into a movement. At the height of his rebellion, between roughly 1,400 and 1,410, he controlled large portions of Wales. He held his own parliament at Machynlleth, a town in the heart of Wales, where there is still a building called the Parliament House, a place of pilgrimage for those who remember what was briefly attempted there. He forged diplomatic alliances with the King of France and with Scottish leaders, and even with some English nobles who opposed the Lancastrian crown. He styled himself Prince of Wales and began to behave like one issuing documents, making policy, imagining a future in which Wales was genuinely independent. But the rebellion did not succeed. Henry IV, and then his son, the young prince who would become Henry V, responded with persistent military pressure, with the garrisoning of Welsh castles, with the slow strangling of Glyndŵr's resources and alliances. By 1410 or so, the rebellion was fading. Glyndŵr himself, and this is one of the strangest, most haunting aspects of the whole story, simply vanished. He was never captured. He was never publicly executed. he was never formally defeated in any final, decisive confrontation. He simply disappeared from the historical record sometime around 1412 or 1415, slipping out of the light of history into a shadow so deep that his actual death was never recorded. In Welsh folk memory, he became a figure who would return in Wales's hour of need, a king sleeping under a hill, like the older legend of Arthur that his story echoes and intertwines with. The aftermath of the rebellion left Wales changed in ways both visible and invisible. The penal laws, a series of discriminatory statutes passed in the years after 1400, placed new restrictions on Welsh people. Welsh men could not hold certain offices. Welsh people living in English towns faced particular regulations. Welsh land in areas that had been rebellious was sometimes confiscated and given to English settlers. The physical landscape of Wales was marked by English garrison castles, by the evidence of military occupation, by the memory of what had been attempted and had not quite succeeded, and many Welsh families had been involved in the rebellion in one way or another. The Tudors of Anglesey were not untouched by it. Some of Owen's relatives, members of his extended family, had been associated with the Glyndŵr cause. This meant consequences when the rebellion ended, reduced standing, some loss of property or opportunity, the kind of quiet, ongoing punishment that powerful governments have always inflicted on families who backed the losing side. Owen Tudor, born into this world, grew up knowing all of this. He grew up speaking Welsh, hearing Welsh poetry, understanding Welsh history. He grew up knowing that his family had seen better days and understanding why. He grew up with the particular combination of pride and pragmatism that characterizes people who come from a noble tradition that has been knocked somewhat sideways by history but refuses to be knocked down entirely. And at some point in his young manhood, the historical record is genuinely uncertain about exactly when and how Owen left Anglesey and crossed into England. The decision to seek service in England would not have been unusual for a young man of his background and circumstances. Service in a great household was a recognized path for young men of decent family who needed to make their way in the world. You learned by serving. You gained connections by being present in the right places. You built a reputation through the quality of your work and the steadiness of your character. If you were lucky, if you were capable, if you had the right qualities of personality and judgment, you could rise, not to greatness, necessarily not automatically, but to a secure and respectable position in the world, to a life that honored your origins even if it did not restore all that had been lost. Owen seems to have had the qualities that made such a rise possible. The evidence, fragmentary as it is, suggests a man of considerable personal charm and social ease. A man who could navigate the complex hierarchies of a royal court without either losing himself or making enemies unnecessarily. A man who was likable, dependable, and crucially discreet. In the world of the royal household, discretion was one of the most valued qualities a servant could possess. People who could keep secrets, who could be trusted with the private realities of powerful people's lives, were invaluable. And Owen Tudor, whatever else might be said about him, was a man who understood the importance of silence. By the early 1420s, Owen Tudor was in England, moving in circles connected to the royal court. The England he was entering was, at that particular moment, at the very height of its medieval power and confidence. Henry V sat on the throne, and Henry V was one of the most legendary figures in all of English history. Henry V was born in 1386 and had come to the throne in 1413 at the age of 26. He was not a large man. Surviving portraits show someone lean and intense, with a strong nose, high cheekbones, and a gaze that has been described by modern historians as almost predatory in its focused quality. He was a man of iron self-discipline. He was deeply, sincerely, completely religious. He attended Mass multiple times daily, even on military campaigns where the demands of war might have seemed to justify reducing such observances. He took his faith not as a performance for his subjects, but as the central organizing principle of his entire existence. He believed, with complete and unshakable conviction, that he was doing God's work when he pursued his claim to the French throne. And he backed that belief with extraordinary military energy and organizational ability. His court was large, elaborate, and deeply ceremonial. The medieval English royal court was a world unto itself, hundreds of people in dozens of roles, from the great lords who advised the king on matters of state down through knights and esquires and pages and yeomen, all the way to the servants who made the fires and swept the floors and kept the vast, complicated machinery of a royal household running. There were strict hierarchies who could enter which rooms, who could speak directly to the king, who could eat at which table in the great hall, and navigating those hierarchies required both intelligence and social grace. For a young Welsh man arriving in this world, everything would have been new, the scale of it, the noise and ceremony of it. The English language, which Owen would have needed to use much more consistently here than he had at home in Wales, where Welsh was the natural medium of daily life. The elaborate customs and courtesies that governed every interaction. The need to read quickly and accurately the social landscape of a place where alliances and rivalries were constantly shifting, where a wrong word to the wrong person could close doors permanently. Owen managed. He found his footing. Whatever his route into the royal orbit, and we cannot be certain of the exact details, he eventually secured a position in a royal household. And the particular royal household he found his way into would prove to be the one that changed everything. Catherine of Valois was born on le 27 Octobre 1401 in the royal palace of the Hôtel Saint-Paul in Paris. She was a princess of France, the daughter of Charles VI, King of France, and Isabeau of Bavaria, his queen. On paper, these were impressive credentials. The French royal family was ancient, powerful, prestigious. Their court was one of the great courts of Europe. Their lineage stretched back through centuries of French history. But the reality of Catherine's childhood was considerably more complicated than any of this suggests. Her father, Charles VI, was a man whose reign was defined by something his contemporaries called madness, and what we might today recognize as a severe and recurring mental illness. Charles had periods sometimes lasting months, sometimes longer, in which he was simply unable to function. He did not recognize his own family. He became confused, delusional, sometimes violent. He would fall into states from which no amount of care or treatment could reliably rouse him, and then he would emerge again, apparently recovered, only for another episode to descend without warning. It was unpredictable, terrifying, and absolutely destabilizing for everyone around him. The French royal court under Charles VI was not a place of stable authority and gracious living. It was a place of competing factions, each trying to control the king, and through him, the kingdom, during his incapacities. The Armagnac faction and the Burgundian faction fought a bitter, sometimes violent struggle for dominance. The English, under first Henry IV and then Henry V, were pressing their military advantage in France, seeing the instability of the French court as an opportunity. The country was, for much of Catherine's childhood, genuinely at war both internally and with England. In the middle of all this chaos, Catherine and her siblings grew up. There are accounts, some of them possibly exaggerated for dramatic effect, but probably containing some truth that suggests the royal children were not always well cared for during their father's worst periods. Their household was sometimes understaffed. Their clothes were sometimes shabby. The ordinary, reliable comforts of childhood were not always available to them. They were, paradoxically, among the most politically significant children in Europe, and yet their day-to-day lives could be genuinely precarious. Catherine was one of the younger children. She had brothers and sisters who preceded her in the order of birth, and the French court's attention was often focused on the male heirs, on the question of succession and who would rule after Charles. Catherine, as a princess, was valuable, but valuable in a specific way. Her value was her marriageability. Her usefulness, in the cold political calculations of medieval courts, was her ability to be given in marriage to a powerful man as part of a political alliance. She was beautiful. This seems to be established by multiple independent sources, which tend to agree on a face of quiet, serene loveliness, gentle features, a composed expression, a kind of natural dignity that impressed people. Whatever difficulties her childhood had contained, she emerged from it as a young woman of considerable personal grace. She was educated, she could read and write, which was not universal even among noble women, and she seems to have had a quality of inner stillness that made her a calming presence in rooms that might otherwise be chaotic. And then Henry V of England came looking for a bride. Henry had been campaigning in France since 1415. His victory at Agincourt in October of that year had been one of the most remarkable military upsets of the entire medieval period. A relatively small English army, weakened by illness and long marching, confronted by a French force that outnumbered them significantly and should, by all conventional military reasoning, have destroyed them. Instead, the French cavalry became trapped in the mud. The English longbowmen poured arrow after arrow into the packed, struggling mass of French knights, and by the end of the day the French had suffered thousands of casualties, while English losses were far smaller. The political and psychological impact of Agincourt was enormous. It seemed to validate Henry's claim that God was on his side, that his campaign in France was righteous, that the English crown's claim to the French throne was legitimate and divinely supported. Henry pressed his advantage in the years after Agincourt. He campaigned methodically through Normandy. He captured cities. He negotiated. He was not simply a soldier, he was a political operator of real sophistication, capable of combining military pressure with diplomatic skill to achieve his aims. And his ultimate aim was extraordinary: to be recognized as the rightful heir to the throne of France. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in May 1420, gave him something very close to that. The treaty recognized Henry as heir to Charles VI, the French king's own son. The Dauphin was effectively disinherited. Henry would become King of France upon Charles's death. And to seal this extraordinary arrangement, Henry would marry Catherine. The marriage took place at Troyes on the 2nd of June 1420. Catherine was 18, Henry was 32. By the standards of royal marriages, in which the feelings of the parties were often entirely secondary to the political logic of the alliance, this one seems to have had some genuine warmth in it. Henry, who was not a man given to frivolous feeling of any kind, appears to have found his young queen genuinely attractive and agreeable. He brought her to England in early 1421. She was crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey on February 23 of that year. In a ceremony of considerable pomp, a procession through the streets of London, cheering crowds, the formalities of anointing and crowning conducted in the great abbey that had hosted English coronations for centuries. London welcomed its new French queen with genuine enthusiasm, or at least with the surface appearance of it. Catherine rode through the streets and heard the crowds. She sat at banquets and received the formal attentions of the English nobility. She adapted to her new country with what appears, from the outside, to have been grace and composure. And then she conceived. Their son Henry was born at Windsor Castle on the 6th of December 1421. A boy, an heir, the answer to the most politically urgent question any royal couple could face. The baby was healthy. The dynasty seemed secure. Henry V never truly knew his son. He had already returned to France by the time the baby was a few months old. The campaigns continued. The requirements of maintaining the agreement of Troyes, of actually governing the territories he now claimed, of keeping the complex alliances that held his position together, all of this consumed him. He was a man who ran on will and duty and religious conviction, and those qualities had their limits. The campaigns in France were physically brutal. Medieval warfare was not a comfortable business at the best of times, and Henry was not a man who sheltered himself from its hardships. He ate what his soldiers ate. He campaigned in all weathers. His body, which had been under enormous strain for years, was by the summer of 1422 beginning to fail. The illness that killed Henry V is most commonly described as dysentery, a devastating disease that spreads easily through armies, that dehydrates and weakens its victims with terrible efficiency, and from which there was no reliable treatment in the medieval period. He grew weaker through that summer. His commanders and advisors watched with increasing alarm, and on the 31st of August 1422, at the Château de Vincennes outside Paris, Henry V died. He was 35 years old. He had been King of England for 9 years. He had been, in the reckoning of his own time and of much of subsequent history, one of the greatest warrior kings England had ever produced. He had won Agincourt. He had conquered Normandy. He had been recognized as heir to France. He had married a French princess and produced an heir. And then he died at 35, leaving behind a 9-month-old baby who was now, by the laws and treaties his father had created, King of England and nominally King of France as well. Catherine was not yet 21 years old. She was a widow. She was alone in a foreign country, a country she had lived in for barely a year, whose language she had needed to learn, whose customs were different from everything she had grown up with. And the baby who now theoretically ruled 2 kingdoms needed her in a way that no political arrangement could fully provide for. She was his mother. She was the one constant in his small, dependent world. She came back to England. She had her official household, her ladies-in-waiting, her chaplains, her stewards and servants, the whole complex domestic apparatus of a queen's life. She had income from her dower lands. She had comfortable residences. She was not, in any material sense, destitute or poorly provided for. But she was a queen dowager now, not a reigning queen. The power, such as it was in England while a baby occupied the throne, was in the hands of the Regency Council. Henry's brothers, Bedford and Gloucester, were the dominant figures. Catherine had a role. She was the king's mother, and that role carried dignity and ceremonial significance. But she was not at the center of anything. She was in the waiting room of history, watching her small son grow up under the supervision of men who had far more influence over his upbringing than she did. She was 20 years old. She was 22. She was 24. The years went by. She fulfilled her ceremonial functions. She appeared at court when required. She lived the regulated, formal, beautiful, and somewhat hollow life of a woman whose importance was almost entirely retrospective, defined by what she had been rather than what she was, by the husband she had lost and the son she had borne rather than by anything she was currently doing or deciding. She must have been lonely, not in the simple, uncomplicated way of someone who lacks company. Her household was full of people, but in the deeper, quieter way of someone who lacks genuine connection, someone who is always being watched, always being managed, always representing something rather than simply being someone whose private feelings are irrelevant to the world that surrounds them. And it was into this particular loneliness, this particular emotional landscape, soft and quiet and aching at its edges, that Owen Tudor stepped, not dramatically, not obviously, quietly, as befitted a man who was learning that discretion was his most important quality. He was there. He was present. He was warm. And in a world that was often cold in its formality, warmth was perhaps the rarest and most valuable thing of all. Owen Tudor's exact role in Catherine's household is a matter of some historical uncertainty. Different sources suggest slightly different positions: clerk of the wardrobe, master of the wardrobe, or another domestic administrative role. What is clear is that whatever his title, his position put him in regular, close contact with the private, domestic life of the Queen's household. He was not someone Catherine saw only at formal court occasions, on his knees at the prescribed distance, offering the prescribed ceremonious respect. He was present in the quieter, more ordinary rhythms of daily life, the management of the household's practical affairs, the movement between Catherine's various residences, the internal workings of a domestic world that was sheltered from the more public aspects of the court. Proximity, over time, creates its own kind of intimacy. It is one of the most basic truths of human life, as relevant in the candlelit chambers of a 15th century royal household as it is anywhere else. When you see someone every day, when you learn their habits and their rhythms, when you have countless small interactions, countless brief exchanges, countless moments of ordinary human contact, something accumulates, whether it is respect or comfort, or eventually something warmer than either of those. Something builds. We do not know how long it took. We do not know the exact sequence of conversations, the particular moments when the dynamic between them shifted from purely professional to something more personal. History has not preserved those details for us. What history has preserved is the result, the evidence of children, the eventual, reluctant acknowledgement by the world that Owen Tudor and Catherine of Valois had been something to each other that the law of England explicitly forbade. Think for a moment about what Owen must have been like through Catherine's eyes. He was Welsh, which in the English court of the 1420s made him something of an outsider, someone who came from a different tradition, who carried a different cultural identity. But that difference, from Catherine's particular vantage point, might not have been a disadvantage. Catherine was herself an outsider in England, French-born, French-educated, always somewhat apart from the world she was now required to inhabit. Perhaps she recognized in Owen a fellow traveler in the experience of navigating a world not entirely one's own. Perhaps she found in the Welsh cultural tradition he carried its poetry, its music, its ancient sense of itself as something separate and enduring a resonance with her own sense of Frenchness, her own awareness of being connected to a tradition that England's court could not fully contain. Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps it was simply that Owen was kind, that he was genuinely present with her in a way that the elaborate formality of court life made difficult for others to be, that he saw her not the queen, not the mother of the king, not the political piece on the chessboard, but the woman, the person, Catherine, who had spent so much of her life being managed and arranged and used by the needs of others, may have found that being simply seen was worth more than almost anything else the world could offer. Whatever the chemistry of it was, and we are speculating, honestly, as we must when the record does not tell us directly, it deepened. The professional relationship shifted, the formal distance narrowed, and at some point, in a decision that must have required both enormous courage and the kind of feeling that makes courage feel almost irrelevant, they chose to be together. The law of England was clear on the subject of Queen's dowager and remarriage. A statute passed in the parliamentary session of 1427 to 1428 decreed that whoever married the king's mother without royal permission would forfeit all their lands and possessions to the crown. The intent was entirely transparent. The king's mother was a politically sensitive figure. Her remarriage, if it were to happen, needed to be controlled and directed by the council, used for political advantage, managed so that it did not create complications for the governance of a kingdom still in the hands of regency. Personal feeling had no place in such calculations. Owen and Catherine appear to have married anyway. The historical consensus accepts that they did, though the exact date and circumstances cannot be established with certainty. Different historians place the marriage at different points between approximately 1428 and 1432. There was no public announcement. There was no parliamentary approval. There was no ceremony conducted before the assembled nobility of England. Whatever form the marriage took and a priest and witnesses there would have been, for both of them were devout Christians for whom marriage was a sacrament, something sacred and binding. It was quiet, hidden, conducted in the shadows with the full understanding that it could not be brought into the light. Who knew? This is a question that intrigues historians and cannot be fully answered. Some of Catherine's household must have known, or at least suspected. Her ladies-in-waiting, who were present in the closest domestic spaces of her life, would have been almost impossible to deceive entirely. There may have been a small circle of trusted people, loyal, devoted, aware of the risk they were taking by keeping silent, who knew what had happened and chose to protect their mistress by saying nothing. The secret endured for years, which speaks to a remarkable degree of collective discretion. Their life together was built inside the structure of Catherine's official household. From the outside, Owen remained a member of the household staff present, useful in his appropriate role. From the inside, he was something entirely different. Her husband, her partner, the person with whom she had chosen to make a private life in the middle of a very public existence. It was a demanding kind of double life. It required constant vigilance about what was said to whom, about how their interactions appeared to observers, about maintaining the fiction of the professional relationship while living the reality of the personal one. And children came. Their first child, their first surviving son, was born around 1432. 1430 or 1431. The historical sources are not perfectly consistent on the exact date, but it was in this period that Edmund Tudor came into the world. His birth, like so much else about this family, was not publicly announced. There was no official registration. He was born healthy, apparently robust, destined to be the vehicle of one of the most extraordinary stories in English history, and he was kept quietly within the shelter of his mother's household. One more small person in a world that was not yet ready to acknowledge what he represented. Close behind Edmund came Jasper, probably born around 1431 or 1432, another son, another boy who was simultaneously half royal, through his mother, the widow of Henry V, sister-in-law of the ruling king, and without any acknowledged status in the world, because his father was a Welsh squire whose marriage to his mother had never been officially sanctioned. There may have been other children. A third son, sometimes called Owen, appears in some historical accounts, thought to have died in infancy or very young childhood. A daughter may also have been born, though the historical record here is particularly thin. Edmund's early years must have been spent within the comfortable domestic world of his mother's household. He would have known warmth, safety, routine, the ordinary pleasures and securities of childhood in a well-maintained establishment. He would have heard French spoken by his mother and some of the household. He would have heard English from others around him. He would have heard, perhaps in private moments with his father, the Welsh language of Owen's origins, that ancient, musical tongue that carried within it the whole history of the people Owen came from. Edmund was, from his first breath, a convergence of worlds, Welsh and English, French and royal, common and extraordinary. Catherine watched her sons grow. She must have watched with a complicated mixture of joy and anxiety, the love she felt for them tangled with the constant awareness of their precarious position, of the secret that surrounded their existence, of the fact that the world they were growing up in had not yet been persuaded to accept them. She was their shield. Her presence, her status as the Queen Dowager, provided a kind of informal protection. While she was alive, while she was present, the secret had somewhere to live. But Catherine's health was declining. By the mid-1430s, she was visibly less well than she had been. She spent more and more time at Bermondsey Abbey, a Benedictine priory south of the Thames, in an area that would much later become part of London, but was then a relatively quiet, separate place from the busy city. Religious houses offered things that the court could not always provide: peace, regularity, the healing properties of a slower, more contemplative pace of life. Whether Catherine went to Bermondsey primarily for her health, or for spiritual comfort, or for the relief of a quieter environment, or for some combination of all of these reasons, she retreated there in the last months of her life, retreated from the world that had demanded so much from her and given her so little of what she had truly needed. On the 3rd of January 1437, Katherine of Valois died at Bermondsey Abbey. She was 35 years old, the same age, with an almost unbearable symmetry, as Henry V, when he had died 15 years earlier. She was buried at Bermondsey, and later her remains were moved. She left behind a 15-year-old son who was King of England, a boy she had not been allowed to raise herself, who had been in the hands of tutors and counselors and guardians almost from the start, who wore a crown that was already beginning to show the first signs of the instability that would define his reign. She left behind a secret husband who was now, suddenly, without the protection that her living presence had provided. She left behind several small children whose very existence was a challenge to the order of the world around them. Owen Tudor was arrested not long after Catherine's death. The exact timing varies slightly in different accounts, but within a matter of weeks or months before the year 1437 was out, certainly the men of the Royal Council had Owen in custody. With Catherine gone, with the protection her presence had provided now removed, the situation could no longer be managed through silence and willful inattention. The secret marriage was now a political fact that required a response. Owen was first held at Newgate Prison. This was not a comfortable institution. Newgate was one of London's principal prisons in this period, a grim, stone-walled place in the city of London. attached to the old gate in the city wall of the same name, housing a mixture of criminals, debtors, and political prisoners in conditions that ranged from merely uncomfortable for those who could pay for better treatment to genuinely brutal for those who could not. The smell of Newgate, its noise, its crowding, its darkness, all of this would have been a dramatic reversal from the quiet, ordered comfort of Catherine's household. Owen, however, was not without resources or supporters. He had spent years building connections in the world of the royal court. Some of those connections held. More importantly, his situation had a complexity. The king's secret stepfather, the father of royal half-siblings, that made the authorities somewhat cautious about proceeding with maximum harshness. He was not executed. He was not subjected to the most extreme penalties that the law might theoretically have allowed. There was a recognition, however uncomfortable, that Owen's children existed, that they had royal blood, however irregular their circumstances, that this fact needed to be handled carefully rather than brutally. Owen attempted to escape from custody at least once, possibly more than once. He was recaptured. He was moved between different places of confinement as the authorities tried to figure out what exactly to do with him. The legal proceedings against him were not swift or simple. Eventually, after a period that stretched over months, and probably well into 1438, Owen was released freed on recognizance, required to make himself available to the authorities, but no longer actively imprisoned. He would spend years in the relative obscurity that followed, never regaining the position he had held in Catherine's household, but also never entirely abandoned by the world. His sons, Edmund and Jasper, were the future, and the future, when it came, would be far more generous to Owen and his children than anyone in 1437 might have predicted. But for Edmund and Jasper, the immediate years after their mother's death were ones of transition. The boys were placed in the care of Catherine de la Pole, Abbess of Barking. This arrangement tells us something about how the authorities viewed the Tudor boys. They were given to the care of a respectable woman of high birth, in a reputable religious house, in a setting appropriate for children of standing. They were not treated as embarrassing inconveniences to be hidden away. They were being provided for, educated, kept in a situation appropriate to the ambiguous but real significance of their birth. Barking Abbey was a Benedictine house in Essex, east of London. It was substantial and well endowed, one of the wealthier and more prestigious abbeys in the region. Its abbess, Catherine de la Pole, was the sister of William de la Pole, who would later become Duke of Suffolk and one of the most powerful men in England. This was, in other words, not a random or careless choice of guardian. The Tudor boys were being placed with someone connected to the inner circles of English power. Life at Barking Abbey would have been ordered and structured, the bells marking the canonical hours, the rhythm of prayer and study and meals, the quiet corridors, the gardens, the sense of a world turned inward and protected from the noise and turbulence outside. Edmund would have received his basic education here, reading, writing, Latin, the foundations of learning that any man of his eventual station would need. He would have encountered books, perhaps for the first time in any serious way. He would have sat in a schoolroom or a library and begun the long process of acquiring the intellectual tools that his extraordinary future would require. He would also have grown. He would have moved from the small boy who had lost his mother into someone older, more aware of the world, more capable of beginning to understand what his own position in that world actually was. The half-brother who wore the crown of England, the father who had been arrested, who was somewhere out in that larger world beyond the abbey walls. The question unspoken, perhaps, but present of what any of this meant for Edmund's own future. That question would be answered sooner than he might have expected, and the answer would come from the most unexpected and most important source possible, the king himself, the half-brother, the boy who was also, in his own way, a child of loss and loneliness and the complicated aftermath of a great man's death. Their meeting Edmund's entry into the light of his half-brother's court was still a few years away, but it was coming, and when it came, it would begin the next chapter of Edmund Tudor's remarkable, shadow-lit life. Let the candle burn low here, for a moment. Let the first part of this whispered story rest. Edmund is a boy at Barking Abbey. His mother is gone. His father is somewhere in the wider world, navigating the aftermath of their love. The king who shares his blood is growing up not far away, presiding over a kingdom that is already showing the first cracks of the troubles that will consume it. The world is poised on the edge of changes that will reshape everything. Owen Tudor arrived at the edge of one of the most formidable institutions in the medieval world. The royal court of England under Henry V was not simply a place where a king lived and worked. It was a machine, a complex, expensive, elaborate machine built for the production and maintenance of royal power. It consumed enormous resources. It employed hundreds of people in dozens of specialized roles. It had its own internal geography rooms and halls and corridors organized according to the precise gradations of rank and access that governed every aspect of its daily life. At the outer edges of this geography were the great public spaces, the great hall where meals were served in elaborate ceremony, where petitioners could present themselves on the right days, where the full pageantry of the royal household was on display. Further in came the household proper, the rooms where the king's advisors and attendants worked, where the business of governance was conducted, where access was increasingly restricted by rank and role. And at the very center, inaccessible to all but the most senior and trusted, were the king's private apartments, his bedchamber, his study, the intimate spaces where a man could, for a moment, be less the king and more himself. Owen would have operated somewhere in the outer and middle rings of this geography. As a member of the household staff in whatever precise capacity, he would have been present in the working spaces of the royal establishment, moving through the corridors between the stores and the administrative rooms, interacting with the other members of the household in the ordinary course of his duties. He would have eaten in the household, probably in the hall with other members of the staff, at a table appropriate to his rank. He would have had a place to sleep in the extensive warren of rooms that any great medieval household required. He would have worn the livery of the household, the distinctive colors and badges that identified the servants of a royal person, that marked them as belonging to a particular institution and a particular lord. Learning to navigate this world was itself a kind of education. The hierarchy was strict and required constant attention, speaking out of turn, claiming more access than your role entitled you to, failing to show the appropriate deference to those above you in the household hierarchy. Any of these missteps could damage your position, your reputation, your ability to move forward. Owen, who had grown up in a world with its own elaborate social codes, would have understood the need for attentiveness and care. He learned the English court's particular language of status and precedence. He watched carefully. He measured his words and his movements. He was, by all suggestion from what we know of his character, a quick and accurate reader of the social situations around him. Henry V himself was a man who demanded high standards from his household. He was not a king who tolerated sloppiness or confusion in the running of his establishment. The court under Henry was efficient, well organized, and deeply shaped by Henry's own values. Religious seriousness, military discipline, the importance of clear hierarchy clearly maintained. Music was valued. Henry was himself a musician of genuine ability, and the royal chapel was one of the finest musical establishments in Europe. Learning was valued, within the limits of the time. French was used alongside English in the upper reaches of the court, which would have been immediately comfortable for Catherine and useful for Owen to learn. Owen learned. He adapted. He found his particular place and made himself valuable in it. The qualities that would later prove so significant in his relationship with Catherine, his ease with people, his discretion, his capacity for loyalty, were being forged and refined in these years of royal service. In the day-to-day demands of operating in the most complex household in England. And then Henry V died, and everything changed. And the household that Owen had learned to navigate was reorganized around its new center. Not a warrior king, but a grieving queen and a baby. And Owen's particular qualities, those qualities that had made him a reliable and discreet household servant, were about to become something considerably more personal and considerably more dangerous. The secret life of Owen Tudor and Katherine of Valois had its own particular textures, its own particular rhythms, shaped by the requirements of concealment and by the genuine domestic realities of a household that had to function normally on its surface while hiding something extraordinary in its interior. Consider what the passing of a year looked like for them. Spring in England, the lengthening of the days, the return of colour to the gardens of whichever royal residence Catherine was inhabiting, the sense of the world opening up again after the constriction of winter. Catherine would have been involved in the ceremonial observances of Easter, one of the great religious festivals of the Catholic calendar, with its full round of services and rituals that she took seriously. Owen, present in his household role, would have observed the same ceremonies. They would have been in the same spaces, at the same times, sharing the same days, and yet in public maintaining the distance that their respective positions required. Summer, with its longer light and its warmth, allowed for more outdoor life. The gardens and parks associated with royal residences were real spaces of activity and leisure, not simply ornamental backdrops. A royal household in summer might move between residences, following the season, taking advantage of different estates and their particular offerings. These movements, the whole elaborate business of packing and transporting the goods of a great household, of establishing at a new location and then establishing again, required exactly the kind of practical management that Owen's household role was concerned with. He would have been deeply involved in the logistics of these seasonal transitions. And in those transitions, in the bustle and reorganization and re-establishment, there were necessarily moments of less formality, of arrangements less rigidly defined by the normal rules of court life. Autumn, with the harvest and the preparations for winter, with the shortening days and the return of indoor life, of candlelight and firelight, of the intimate, enclosed world of a household gathering itself against the cold. Catherine would have had her embroidery, her reading, her religious observances, the company of her ladies. Owen would have had his work, and in the evenings, when the public parts of the day were done and the household had settled into its private rhythms, the spaces between them might have narrowed. Winter, the darkest time, the time when, in the long evenings, stories were told and music was made, and the human need for warmth and connection was at its most acute. The fires in the great hearths, the candles guttering in the draughts, the world outside cold and dark and remote. Inside, the particular intimacy of a household that knows itself, that has established its own routines and relationships, that has become a community over the years. In all these seasons, the love between Owen and Catherine grew, not dramatically, or at least not in the dramatic, sudden way of romantic legend, but in the accumulated way that real relationships grow, through shared time, through ordinary moments, through the gradual, almost imperceptible development of understanding and trust and tenderness that comes from being genuinely present to another person through the changing seasons of years. Their children were born into this hidden domestic world. Edmund and Jasper came into a household that was officially the household of the Queen Dowager and was secretly also the household of a family, a small, carefully concealed family, but a real one. The boys would have known their father, in those early years, in the particular way that children in complex households know the adults around them, through regular presence, through daily interaction, through the texture of a familiar face and voice. Owen was there. He was not the absent or distant father that some accounts of this period might unconsciously imply. He was present in the daily life of Catherine's household, present in Edmund's early experience of the world, present in the domestic reality that shaped the first years of Edmund's consciousness. And when Catherine died, and that world collapsed, and Owen was taken away, and Edmund was placed at Barking, the boy was losing not just his mother, but the entire world that had contained him, the world of the household, of Owen's daily presence, of the particular security of a hidden family that had, for all its precariousness, been genuinely home. The years Edmund spent at Barking Abbey were years in which he was being shaped for a future that no one yet knew would be his. He was being educated, in the broad sense of that word, not just taught to read and write and cipher and pray, though all of that was happening, but educated in the fuller sense of being formed into a person who could take his place in the world. Medieval education, for a boy of good birth, was built on a foundation of Latin, the language of the Church, of scholarship, of legal and administrative documents throughout Europe. Learning Latin meant more than learning a language. It meant gaining access to the entire universe of medieval learning, which was recorded, discussed, and transmitted in Latin almost exclusively. It meant being able to read and understand not just the liturgy of the Mass, but the great works of theology, of philosophy, of history that the medieval world had produced, and that formed the educated mind's understanding of itself and its world. At Barking, Edmund would have had access to books. The abbey would have had a library, not a large library by modern standards, but a real one, containing the kind of religious and philosophical works that a major Benedictine house would accumulate. He would have read the Psalms. He would have encountered the Church Fathers Augustine, Jerome, Gregory. He would have read some of the medieval theological works that shaped the intellectual culture of the period. He would have learned to read with the particular slowness and attentiveness that medieval reading often required, a form of reading that was closer to meditation than to the rapid scanning that modern reading often becomes. He would also have learned the practical skills of a nobleman, or rather, he would have been positioned to learn them when he moved into the wider world of the court. Horsemanship, the management of weapons, the protocols of formal interaction with people of rank, the music that was expected of an educated person of his station, the French that he would need for interactions at court. These things were not primarily available at Barking. They were things he would learn later, in the context of his half-brother's household, when the world finally opened up to him. But what Barking gave him, perhaps more than any specific knowledge or skill, was something harder to name and more durable than all the practical accomplishments, a particular kind of inner stability, a quality of self-possession, a capacity for patience. Boys who grow up in regulated environments, in the rhythms of monastic life, with its reliable structure of prayer and work and rest, often develop a certain quality of stillness that more chaotic childhoods do not always produce. Edmund, in the ordered peace of Barking Abbey, with its bells and its routines and its clear framework of expectation, Edmund may have developed something of this quality, a quality that would serve him well in the complicated years ahead, in the court of a troubled king, in the political demands of his earldom, in the brief months of his Welsh mission. He grew, he learned, he became, in those Barking years, the person who would step into the royal court and find his footing there, who would receive a title with composure, who would discharge his responsibilities with apparent competence, who would die when the time came with the kind of dignified steadiness that suggested someone who had made his peace with the world and its unpredictabilities long before the final test arrived. Tonight, we will watch Edmund step into the light of the royal court for the first time in any real sense. We will watch him receive a title, lands, and a recognized place in the world. We will meet the young woman who will become his wife, Margaret Beaufort, a girl of 12 years old with royal blood of her own, and a future that neither she nor Edmund could have imagined. And we will follow Edmund into Wales, into the gathering storm of one of the most dramatic political crises England had ever seen, toward the fate that was quietly, inexorably approaching. Let's settle in, let the room grow soft, and let the story continue. Henry VI grew up under the eye of a regency council and a succession of tutors and guardians. He was, by all accounts, a peculiar child, serious, gentle, intensely religious from a very young age, without any of the martial energy or political shrewdness that had made his father legendary. Where Henry V had been a force of nature, focused, disciplined, driven by a clear and powerful sense of purpose, Henry VI seemed to be made of softer material. He was kind, he was devout, he was genuinely interested in learning and in the works of God as he understood them. He would go on to found Eton College and King's College, Cambridge institutions of learning that still exist today, that still bear the mark of his genuine care for education and scholarship. These are real achievements, and they deserve acknowledgement. But kingship in 15th century England required more than kindness and piety. It required the ability to manage powerful, ambitious noblemen who were constantly testing the limits of royal authority. It required the capacity to make difficult decisions quickly and stick to them under pressure. It required, on occasion, the willingness to be ruthless, to reward friends decisively, and punish enemies clearly enough that everyone in the kingdom understood the nature of power and where it actually resided. Henry VI did not have these qualities. He seems, genuinely, to have not been constructed for the role he had been born into. He was a gentle person, placed in a position that required iron. As he grew older, he was declared of age to rule in 1437. The same year that his mother Catherine died, he began to take more active control of his own affairs. And one of the things he turned his attention to, with what appears to have been genuine warmth and genuine feeling, was the question of his mother's other children, Edmund and Jasper Tudor, his half-brothers, who had been growing up in the margin of the court's awareness, in the quiet shelter of Barking Abbey. Henry seems to have felt something real for his half-brothers. The precise nature of his emotional relationship with them is, like so much of his inner life, difficult to read from the historical distance, but the actions he took on their behalf suggest an affection that went beyond mere political calculation. He brought them to court. He gave them a recognized place in the world of English nobility. He treated them in the ways that the formal language of medieval lordship allowed. As family, Edmund and Jasper first appear at court in a recognizable way in the late 1430s or early 1440s. They were teenagers by then. Edmund in his early to mid-teens, Jasper a little younger. What was it like, we might quietly wonder, to walk into the great hall of a royal court for the first time as something other than a secret, to be acknowledged rather than hidden? Edmund had spent the years of his most recent memory at Barking Abbey, a comfortable and respectable place, certainly, but a small place, a sheltered place, a place where the scope of life was defined by the hours of prayer and the bounds of the abbey walls. Now, suddenly, he was being brought into a world of extraordinary scale and complexity, a world of great lords and political intrigue, of elaborate ceremony and ancient hierarchy, of choices and consequences that could determine the fate of kingdoms. He adapted. He must have had some of his father's social ease, that quality of finding one's footing in unfamiliar environments without losing oneself. He learned the ways of the court. He became, in the years of his late adolescence and early manhood, a recognized presence in Henry's household, someone known to the king, valued by the king, and beginning to be known to the wider world of English nobility as someone worth paying attention to. Henry's recognition of his half-brothers became formal and official in 1452. In that year, Edmund Tudor was created Earl of Richmond, and Jasper Tudor was created Earl of Pembroke. These were not minor titles. These were substantial earldoms, with lands and income attached to them, with recognized status in the hierarchy of the English nobility, with a place at court and in Parliament that could not be disputed or dismissed. The grants were also accompanied by formal legitimization, an act of Parliament that confirmed Edmund and Jasper as legitimate sons of Owen Tudor and Katherine of Valois, removing the legal ambiguity about their status that had hung over them since their parents' secret marriage. The ceremony of creation as Earl would have been one of the most significant moments of Edmund's life. These ceremonies were formal, elaborate affairs, the recipient dressed in the appropriate robes, kneeling before the king, receiving the symbolic items that represented the dignity being conferred: a sword, a robe, the letters patent that set out the terms of the title, and then the formal acknowledgement of the new Earl's place in the order of things, his seat in the House of Lords, his rank among the other nobles of England, his recognized standing before the law and the court. Edmund rose from that ceremony as Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. He was perhaps 21 or 22 years old. He had been born without any acknowledged status in the world, the secret son of a secret marriage, a boy who existed in the gap between the official version of Catherine of Valois' life and its hidden reality. And now he was an earl. He had lands. He had income. He had a place at court. He had, for the first time in his life, a fully recognized identity in the world that surrounded him. How did he feel? Standing there, in his new robes, with his new title, in the hall of his half-brother's court. We can only imagine. Perhaps there was something deeply satisfying about it, the formal, official, irreversible recognition of a worth and a position that the world had long refused to acknowledge. Perhaps there was something more complicated than satisfaction, a sense of all the years that had preceded this moment, of his mother who had not lived to see it, of his father who had paid such a high price for the love that made Edmund possible. Perhaps there was simply the forward-looking energy of a young man of ability who had just been given the tools he needed to make something of himself in the world. Owen Tudor was still alive at this point. His son's elevation presumably brought him some joy, some sense of vindication, some quiet, private satisfaction at the recognition that the children his secret love had produced were being given the place in the world that their blood deserved. He was not a great figure at court, Owen. He lived out his later years in relative quietness, never the center of things, never fully rehabilitated to a position of prominence. But he was alive. He could see what his sons were becoming. Edmund, Earl of Richmond, settled into his new life at court. He was a young man of what appears, from the fragmentary evidence, to have been considerable personal appeal. He was educated. The years at Barking had given him the intellectual foundations, and his years at court had added to them. He was connected to the king, to the Beaufort family, who were important Lancastrian supporters, to the Welsh community within the English court. He was energetic, apparently, and willing to serve. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of young nobleman that a court under pressure, and Henry's court was already, by the early 1450s, beginning to feel the pressure that would soon become a crisis needed and valued. And he was about to receive a responsibility that would shape the rest of his life in ways he could not yet foresee. He was about to be given wardship of a young woman, a 12-year-old girl with royal blood, a substantial inheritance, and a future that was, in the medieval legal system, entirely in the hands of whoever controlled her wardship. Her name was Margaret Beaufort. To understand the extraordinary significance of Margaret Beaufort and the profound weight of the moment when her life became entangled with Edmund Tudor's, you need to understand who she was and where she came from. Because Margaret was not simply a wealthy heiress whose wardship happened to come into Edmund's hands by administrative convenience. She was a young woman of remarkable lineage, of blood that connected her to the deepest and most contested questions of royal legitimacy in the England of her time. She was, in short, a piece in a game of dynastic chess whose stakes were nothing less than the throne of England itself. Margaret Beaufort was born on the 31st of May 1443 at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire. Her father was John Beaufort, the first Duke of Somerset. Her mother was Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe. From her mother's side, Margaret received a comfortable, established gentry background, respectable, prosperous, connected to the networks of English county society. But it was from her father's side that she received the blood that made her, in the calculations of the most powerful people in England, so significant and so sensitive a figure. John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, was a grandson of John of Gaunt, and that connection requires a moment of explanation, because it is absolutely central to everything that follows in this story. And in the longer story of the Tudor dynasty, John of Gaunt was the third surviving son of King Edward III, who ruled England in the middle of the 14th century. John of Gaunt was a powerful and politically significant nobleman in his own right, Duke of Lancaster, immensely wealthy, deeply involved in the politics of his era. He had 3 wives in the course of his life, and children by all of them. By his first wife, Blanche of Lancaster, John had a son who became Henry IV, the first king of the House of Lancaster. This was the legitimate royal line. Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI, all descended from Blanche's children. But John of Gaunt had a long relationship with another woman, a relationship that preceded and overlapped with his third marriage. Her name was Catherine Swynford, and she was the governess of his children, a widow, and eventually the great love of his later life. John and Catherine had 4 children together while he was still married to his second wife, children who were, at the time of their birth, illegitimate. Their surname was Beaufort, taken from a castle in France where John Gaunt had properties. After the death of his second wife, John of Gaunt married Catherine Swynford in 1396, and in 1397, their children the Beauforts were legitimised by Act of Parliament. They became legitimate members of the royal family. They were given titles and recognised as the children of John of Gaunt. But, And this is a crucial but a later act, confirmed under Henry IV, added a stipulation. The Beaufort legitimization excluded them from the line of royal succession. They were legitimate. They were royal relatives. They could hold great titles and positions, but they could not inherit the crown. This exclusion from succession was significant, but it was also ambiguous, legally contested, interpreted differently by different people at different times. As the 15th century progressed, and as the Lancastrian royal line became increasingly fragile, the question of whether the Beaufort claim to succession was truly extinguished or merely dormant became increasingly charged. And Margaret Beaufort, as the daughter of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, as the granddaughter of the John Beaufort who was son of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford, carried this ambiguous, contested, potentially explosive blood. She was, in the careful reckoning of people who thought about such things, a Beaufort claimant, a person whose lineage, if the Lancastrian line failed, might be advanced as a basis for a claim on the crown. Not necessarily directly, she was not herself in a position of great power or influence, and she was only a child. But the potential was there, the blood was there, and in a world where royal succession was a matter of literally life and death importance, the blood mattered enormously. Margaret's father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, died in 1444. Margaret was barely a year old. She never knew her father. He died following a disastrous military campaign in France, an expedition in which he had suffered significant defeat and which had not been forgiven by the political world around him. His death left his infant daughter in a world without his protection, without his guidance, without the personal authority his presence could have provided. What it did leave her was land. The Beaufort estates were substantial. Margaret was her father's heir, and although the legal mechanics of how estates passed through daughters were different and more complicated than through sons in medieval law, the practical reality was that Margaret came with significant wealth attached to her person. This wealth made her wardship the legal right to control the marriage of a minor heir, extremely valuable. Whoever controlled Margaret's wardship controlled not only her future but access to her estates and income during her minority. Wardship in medieval England was a recognized legal institution with an explicit market value. Lords and kings bought and sold wardships. They granted them as political favors. They used them to reward allies and strengthen networks of obligation and loyalty. The ward herself, the child at the center of all this commercial and political activity, had very little say. Her future was being decided by people who held legal authority over her, who might or might not have her genuine interests at heart, who were operating within a system that was entirely designed around the needs of the powerful rather than the preferences of the young and relatively powerless. Margaret's wardship passed through several hands in the years of her early childhood. Initially, it was in the hands of John de la Pole, who was the son of the Duke of Suffolk, a powerful family with significant court connections. Then, as the political winds shifted, as Suffolk fell from power in the late 1440s and was eventually murdered by sailors while being sent into exile in 1450, the wardship situation changed. Henry VI, in an act that appears to reflect his genuine personal interest in his half-brothers, eventually granted the wardship of Margaret Beaufort and the right to arrange her marriage to Edmund and Jasper Tudor. This was an extraordinary gift. Margaret Beaufort, with all that her name, her blood, and her inheritance represented, was being placed in the hands of the two men who were simultaneously the king's closest surviving maternal relatives and the living evidence of his mother's secret love. Edmund Tudor was now the guardian of Margaret Beaufort's future, and he was also, in the logic of the wardship system, the most obvious candidate to be her husband. But before we arrive at the moment of their marriage, let us spend some time with Margaret herself, because Margaret Beaufort was not simply a political piece on a dynastic chessboard. She was a person, one of the most remarkable people of her entire era, though she was only beginning to show it at this point in her story. She was a child who had grown up in the middle of the same political turbulence that Edmund had experienced from a different angle. She had been separated from her father before she could know him, had watched her mother navigate the complexities of widowhood, had lived through the experience of having her future discussed and decided by people who did not primarily think of her as an individual, but as an inheritance. She was small. Surviving descriptions suggest a woman of slight build who remained physically delicate throughout her long life. She was highly intelligent, by all evidence a quality that would become more and more obvious as she grew older, as she took more control of her own affairs, as she demonstrated in decade after decade the kind of focused, strategic thinking that is genuinely rare in any era. She was deeply religious, in the manner of her half-brother Henry VI, sincerely, personally pious, someone for whom faith was not performance but lived reality. She was also, in ways that would only fully reveal themselves much later, extraordinarily determined. She was a woman who understood the world she lived in, who did not delude herself about its cruelties and its constraints, and who found ways to work within those constraints with a skill and a tenacity that were, in retrospect, breathtaking. At 12 years old, in 1455, she was a girl at the beginning of all of this, a girl with royal blood and a complicated inheritance and a future that was in other people's hands, about to meet the man who held that future. Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, was approximately 24 or 25 years old in 1455. He had been at court for years. He had his title, his lands, his recognized place in the world. He had his connection to Henry VI, close, personal, apparently warm, and his connection to the Lancastrian political network that surrounded the king. He was a man of ability and ambition, operating in a court that was increasingly under stress. The year 1455 was not a comfortable one for anyone in the orbit of Henry VI. The political situation in England had been deteriorating for years. The loss of English territories in France, which had proceeded with painful steadiness through the late 1440s and early 1450s, undoing the gains that Henry V had worked so hard and died so young to achieve, had damaged the prestige of the Lancastrian crown. The regency arrangement that had governed England during Henry's minority had produced faction and resentment, and the accumulation of grievances among powerful noblemen who felt they had been treated unfairly, overlooked, cheated of their rightful influence. Most significantly, there was Richard, Duke of York. York was a man of genuine ability and genuine claim through a complicated genealogical argument that we will explore more fully in Part 3. He believed he had a stronger right to the English throne than Henry VI himself. York had served in France, had served as protector of England during Henry's first bout of serious mental illness in 1453, and had developed a political following and a sense of his own importance that made him a formidable and ultimately irreconcilable opponent of the Lancastrian establishment. Edmund and Jasper Tudor were, in this increasingly polarized political landscape, firmly in the Lancastrian camp. They were the king's half-brothers. Their loyalty to Henry VI was personal, familial, and in Edmund's case, at least, apparently genuine. They were not men of purely cynical political calculation. They were men with real emotional investment in the welfare of a king to whom they were connected by blood and by the extraordinary circumstances of their own existence. It was in this charged and complicated political moment that Edmund received the wardship of Margaret Beaufort and began to move toward marriage with her. The marriage took place on the 1st of November 1455. Margaret was 12 years old, 12 years and 5 months. To be precise, Edmund was approximately 24. The age gap was substantial by modern standards, and even by the standards of the medieval period, Margaret was young. Betrothals could take place very young, but actual marriage, and especially consummation of marriage at 12, was considered early even then. The church had guidelines about minimum ages. Custom suggested that most girls married in their mid-teens. That Edmund went ahead with marriage to a girl of 12, and, worse, that he consummated that marriage relatively quickly, as evidenced by the pregnancy that followed, has been a source of discomfort among historians who have written about him. We cannot retroactively impose modern standards of consent and child welfare on a 15th century nobleman operating within the legal and social frameworks of his own time. The wardship system gave Edmund explicit legal authority to arrange Margaret's marriage. Her consent was technically required by canon law, but the practical pressure on a 12-year-old ward to consent to what her guardian proposed would have been enormous. She was a child. He was the adult with all the authority. What we can say is that the marriage created, as quickly as it could, the conditions for a pregnancy that came very close to killing Margaret Beaufort, and that she later described as the defining physical ordeal of her life. We will return to that pregnancy and that birth in part 3. For now, let us stay in the autumn of 1455, in the weeks and months of the new marriage, and try to see what we can see. Edmund and Margaret were married in Wales at Lampay, or possibly at Pembroke, in the southwestern corner of Wales, where the Tudor family's connection to the Pembroke earldom gave them particular presence. The ceremony itself was conducted according to the rites of the Catholic Church, with the prayers and the exchange of vows and the blessing that made the union, in the eyes of the Church and the law, indissoluble. Whatever else we might say about the circumstances, about the ages involved, about the power dynamics, it was a real marriage, legally and spiritually valid in every sense that the medieval world understood. What was Margaret's experience of it? Here we must be honest about the limits of our knowledge. We do not have Margaret's own account of this period of her life. Her writings that have survived are almost exclusively from her later years, when she was a widow and a powerful figure in her own right. We know, from things she said and did later, that she was a woman who felt things deeply, who had a strong sense of her own dignity, who was not easily overawed, but she was also 12 years old, and she was in a world where 12-year-old girls did not generally have much say in what happened to them. What we can say is that the years that followed brief as they were appear, in some fragmentary ways, to suggest that Edmund was not unkind to his young wife. He took her to Wales. He included her in his household. He did not, from what we can tell, simply use her as a political tool and then ignore her existence. Whether she felt anything for him beyond the complex mixture of dependence and accommodation that characterized most medieval marriages of this kind, whether there was warmth, whether there was something that might be called affection, we cannot know with certainty. What we do know is that by the spring of 1456, Margaret was pregnant. Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, had a particular responsibility in Wales. This responsibility was both personal. His father's origins, his own Welsh blood and Welsh name, gave him a specific connection to the country, and political. Wales was a crucial part of the Lancastrian territorial base, and in the increasingly unstable political situation of the mid-1450s, maintaining Lancastrian control over Wales was a matter of real strategic importance. Henry VI's hold on power was, by this point, far from secure. The relationship between the king and Richard, Duke of York, had deteriorated into something that could no longer be managed through the normal channels of political negotiation. In May 1455, the tensions had boiled over into actual violence at the First Battle of St. Albans, a military engagement fought horrifyingly in the streets of a prosperous English market town, a conflict that left several prominent Lancastrian noblemen dead and that announced, in the clearest possible terms, that England's political crisis had reached a point where the ordinary mechanisms of governance could not contain it. St. Albans was not a large battle. It was not a pitched battle between great armies on an open field. It was a short, sharp, brutal encounter that lasted perhaps a few hours, and in which the Yorkist forces, led by Richard of York and his allies, confronted the royal party. Henry VI was personally present, which made the whole thing something bordering on treason, and defeated it. Henry was taken. He was found, reportedly, in a house where he had sheltered during the fighting, mild and confused and bewildered by the violence around him, and the Yorkists brought him back under their control. The political aftermath of St. Albans was a period of York's dominance. York became the dominant figure in the council. His allies held key positions. The Lancastrian cause was in retreat, not defeated but badly shaken. Its momentum interrupted, its key figures dead or diminished. Edmund Tudor's response to this situation was to go to Wales and do his job. His earldom of Richmond gave him territorial and political responsibilities in Wales, specifically in North Wales, though his connections through Jasper's earldom of Pembroke extended to the southwest as well. He went to Wales in 1456 with Margaret and established himself there, working to maintain Lancastrian control, to rally support, to be the visible and effective presence of royal authority in a part of the kingdom where Welsh loyalties and Welsh political networks were a genuinely significant factor. Wales, in 1456, was a complex political landscape in its own right. The principality was governed through a combination of English royal administration and the territorial influence of great lords, Welsh and English, who held lands there. The population of Wales was, as we have seen, a people with a strong sense of their own identity, with memories of resistance and pride, and the long, ongoing project of being Welsh in a world governed by English law. They were not uniformly hostile to English authority. Many Welsh families had found ways of working within the English system, had gained positions and prosperity through accommodation rather than resistance. But they were also not uniformly indifferent to who represented that authority and what it meant. Edmund's Welsh blood was, in this context, an asset. He was the son of Owen Tudor of Anglesey. He carried a Welsh name, even if he wore an English title. His father had been a Welsh squire who had risen to extraordinary heights through his own qualities and a remarkable marriage, a story that was known in Welsh circles and that gave Edmund a particular kind of credibility, a particular connection to Welsh identity that a purely English nobleman would not have had. He was not simply another English lord imposing himself on Wales. He was, in some sense, one of their own. He rode through the Welsh countryside. He held court. He administered. He collected the revenues from his estates, dealt with the local disputes and petitions that came to any lord in any territory, maintained the relationships with local Welsh families and Welsh landowners that were essential to effective governance. He was building the kind of local authority that a Lancastrian presence in Wales required, not just the formal authority of the title, but the lived, personal authority of a lord who was present, engaged, and known. Margaret travelled with him and was present in this Welsh world. She was 13 years old by now, still very young, still in many ways a child, but also, inevitably, being shaped by the experiences she was living through. She was learning what it meant to run a household. She was observing the world of politics and lordship at close range. She was adapting, in the way that remarkably intelligent people always adapt, to circumstances that she had not chosen but could not change. She was also pregnant, growing larger, increasingly aware of the physical reality of the child she was carrying, increasingly aware of how vulnerable this made her. In a world where pregnancy and childbirth were genuinely dangerous, where women died in childbirth with terrible regularity, where the outcome of any pregnancy was entirely uncertain, Edmund cannot have been unaware of how young she was. He cannot have been entirely unaware of the risk, but the political pressures were real, and the requirements of the dynastic system were clear, and he was operating within a framework in which these concerns were managed rather than simply set aside. He had work to do in Wales. He did it, with Margaret at his side, and then the Yorkists came for him. The summer of 1456 was a dangerous summer for Lancastrians in Wales. The political situation in England was still highly unstable following the Yorkist success at St. Albans. York and his allies were looking for ways to consolidate their position, to extend their influence, to demonstrate that the Lancastrian grip on power was weakening and that the Yorkist alternative was stronger and more capable. Part of this effort involved Wales specifically. It involved efforts by Yorkist-aligned lords to extend their own influence in the Welsh territories where Lancastrian power resided. The key figure in what was about to happen to Edmund was a man named William Herbert. William Herbert was a Welsh lord born William ap William, son of a Welsh family that had prospered through service to English lords who had aligned himself firmly with the Yorkist cause. He was ambitious, capable, and determined to advance his own position in Wales by exploiting the political turbulence of the moment. Herbert held considerable power in parts of Wales. and was systematically extending it. In August 1456, Herbert and his forces moved against Edmund Tudor. This was not a casual incursion. This was a deliberate, calculated military and political act, the capture of the king's half-brother, the Lancastrian Earl, who was working to maintain royal control in Wales. Herbert's forces captured Edmund at or near Carmarthen in southwest Wales. Edmund was taken prisoner and confined in Carmarthen Castle. The capture of Edmund Tudor was a significant Yorkist coup, removing the Lancastrian Earl from active engagement in Wales, interrupting his efforts to build and maintain Lancastrian support there, demonstrating that even the king's own half-brother could be seized by Yorkist forces. All of this sent a clear message about the balance of power in the kingdom. It was a message that would have landed with chilling force in the court circles where Henry VI and his advisors were watching events in Wales with increasing alarm. Edmund was a prisoner. His wife, 13 years old, perhaps 5 months pregnant, was somewhere in Wales without him, in a situation of genuine vulnerability. Carmarthen Castle was a strong old castle in southwest Wales, one of the principal English administrative centres in the region, with walls built to last. With all the cold stone solidity that medieval military architecture could provide, being a prisoner in such a place in the middle of the 16th century was not necessarily a death sentence. Prisoners of rank were often held in conditions that, while not comfortable, were not the brutal extremes of the worst medieval imprisonment. They were kept secure. They were fed. If they had political value, and Edmund, as the king's half-brother, had enormous political value, they were kept alive and in reasonable health because their value depended on that. But Carmarthen Castle, in the autumn of 1456, was about to introduce a threat against which political value was entirely irrelevant. A threat that did not discriminate between the prisoner of high rank and the common guard. A threat that crept through stone walls and past locked doors with an ease that no army and no title could prevent. The plague was in Wales, and Edmund Tudor was in its path. Plague was one of the great terrors of the medieval world. It had swept across Europe in the middle of the 14th century, the Black Death of 1347 to 1351, killing somewhere between a third and a half of the entire population of Europe in one of the most devastating demographic catastrophes in human history. But the plague did not end with that first great wave. It returned. Again and again through the 15th century, outbreaks of varying severity swept through different parts of England and Wales, sometimes broadly, sometimes more locally, but always with the same terrible efficiency, the same dreadful symptomatology, the same awful speed. The form of plague that swept through Carmarthen in the autumn of 1456 may have been bubonic plague, the form that produces the characteristic swellings, the buboes, in the lymph nodes of the groin and armpits, or it may have been the pneumonic form, which travels through the air and progresses even faster. We do not know precisely. The historical sources describe Edmund as dying of plague, without the clinical precision that modern medicine would bring to such a description. What the sources agree on is that he fell ill and that he died. Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, died on the 3rd of November 1456. He was, by the most likely reckoning, about 26 years old. He died in Carmarthen Castle, a prisoner of the Yorkist lord who had captured him, far from the court where his half-brother worried, far from the young wife who was carrying his child. The world did not stop when Edmund died. The political crisis that had produced his capture continued. The Wars of the Roses that were slowly, terribly developing would go on without him, would reach heights of violence and devastation that Edmund never lived to see. Henry VI would continue his troubled, increasingly desperate reign. Margaret Beaufort would give birth to their child, would make 3 more marriages, would outlive virtually everyone connected to this story. But in the moment of Edmund's death, let us pause. Let us stay in the shadow of Carmarthen Castle on that November morning in 1456. Let us sit quietly with the fact of this young man's death, the son of Owen Tudor and Katherine of Valois, the half-brother of a king, the husband of a girl barely into her teens, the father of a child not yet born. Let us acknowledge that this death, early and cold and lonely as it was the end of Edmund Tudor's own story, not the end of what he had set in motion, not the end of the name he had carried, but the end of him. The news reached Margaret somehow. We do not know precisely where she was when it happened. She may have already been at Pembroke Castle under the protection of Jasper Tudor, her brother-in-law. We know that by the time her child was born, she was at Pembroke. The exact mechanics of how she got there, who brought her the news of Edmund's death, what she felt in that moment, these things are lost to us. We have the silence of the historical record around this particular, private, devastating moment. She was 13 years old. She was a widow. She was carrying a child whose father had died without ever knowing it would be born. She was alone in Wales, in the middle of a political crisis, in the early months of a pregnancy that her own body, small and young, and not yet fully developed, was going to struggle to survive. That struggle, and the extraordinary birth that would result from it, is where Part 3 will take us. But before we rest here, at the end of Part 2, let us take a moment to think about Edmund himself, to think about the shape of his brief life, as it has come clear to us over the course of these first 2 parts of our story. He was born from love, from the kind of love that does not ask permission, that does not calculate consequences, that simply exists and makes its choice and lives with the result. He grew up in a shadow in the quiet of Barking Abbey, in the careful anonymity of a childhood spent waiting for the world to decide what to make of him. He stepped into the light of his half-brother's court and was given a name, a title, a recognized place in the order of things. He went to Wales and did his duty as he understood it, within the framework of his time and his world. He was captured, imprisoned, and taken by a disease that moved faster than any army. He was 26 years old. In Part 3, we will follow what he left behind into the storm that was coming. We will be with Margaret in Pembroke Castle as she labours, alone and terrified, to bring his child into the world. We will watch the Wars of the Roses reach their terrible height. We will see what becomes of the boy whose birth Edmund never knew of. Rest now, dear traveller. The shadow is patient. Part 3 will be here when you return. Before Edmund Tudor ever entered the story of Margaret Beaufort's life, she had already experienced what it meant to have her future arranged by others according to their own political calculations. The wardship system moved quickly on valuable heiresses, and Margaret was a very valuable heiress indeed. When Margaret was still a very small child, perhaps 2 or 3 years old, no more an arrangement was made that would have shaped her entire life had it held. John de la Pole, son of the Duke of Suffolk and grandson of the powerful Chaucer family, was designated as Margaret's intended husband. The Suffolks were among the most powerful families in England at this point, deeply entrenched in the government of Henry VI, connected to the king and to the Lancastrian establishment in ways that made them extraordinarily influential. The marriage of Margaret Beaufort, with all her blood and all her inheritance to John de la Pole, would have consolidated the Suffolk family's position even further. It would have tied the Beaufort claim, with all its complicated but real royal associations, to a family that was already at the centre of power. Margaret, at 2 or 3, had no opinion about any of this. She was a child being arranged. The betrothal was made on her behalf by the adults who controlled her wardship, as part of the political calculations of people she would not have been able to identify, let alone reason with. For a few years, this was Margaret's future. The de la Pole marriage, the Suffolk connection, the path that had been laid out for her by the people who held her legal destiny in their hands. And then the political world exploded. The Duke of Suffolk, who had been one of the most powerful men in England, deeply enmeshed in the governance of a king who needed strong ministers to govern for him, fell from power dramatically. He was accused of mismanaging the French war, of corruption, of treasonous negotiations with the French. He was impeached by Parliament. Henry VI tried to protect him by sending him into exile rather than allowing him to face trial. The ship carrying Suffolk into exile was intercepted at sea by sailors who, apparently acting on popular outrage, executed him on the spot. His head was struck off and his body thrown overboard. It was one of the most dramatic and shocking political deaths of the mid-15th century, a clear signal that the political situation in England was deteriorating into something dangerous and unpredictable. With Suffolk dead, the de la Pole connection that had defined Margaret's arranged future was dissolved. Her wardship, and with it the right to arrange her marriage, passed back into more central political hands, and Henry VI, with what appears to have been genuine familial feeling, made the decision that placed Margaret's future in Edmund's hands. To fully understand Edmund Tudor's position at Henry VI's court, it is worth spending a little more time with the king himself. Henry VI is one of the most studied and most debated monarchs in English history, not because of his military or political achievements, which were minimal, but because of the extraordinary historical drama that swirled around his reign and the fascinating, tragic question of what he was and what he might have been in different circumstances. Henry was born on the 6th of December 1421, the only child of Henry V and Katherine of Valois. He became king at 9 months old, upon his father's death in August 1422. He never knew his father. The legendary warrior king who had won Agincourt and conquered Normandy and secured the Treaty of Troyes was, to Henry VI, a name and a portrait and a set of expectations, not a man, not a presence, not someone who had played catch with him in the garden or taught him to ride. The absence of Henry V from his son's formation was total, and its consequences were entirely unclear to contemporaries who kept wondering why the son of such a man was so different from his father. Henry VI seems to have inherited his mother's gentleness and his maternal grandfather's instability, in some combination that was, for a medieval king, quite unfortunate. He was not mad in the way that Charles VI had been mad. There was no violent confusion, no failure to recognize faces, no terrifying alternation between apparent normality and catastrophic breakdown in his early decades. But he was mild, passive, easily influenced, deeply religious in a way that sometimes made it difficult for him to engage with the political world at all. The world of religious devotion, of prayer and fasting and charitable giving, was far more congenial to him than the world of hard political choices and the management of aggressive, ambitious noblemen. Edmund knew Henry well. He had grown up, in a sense, alongside the king. Their relationship predated the formal recognition of 1452, went back to the years when Edmund and Jasper had been brought to court as teenagers. Edmund would have observed Henry up close over many years. He would have understood Henry's qualities and Henry's limitations with the clarity that comes from sustained personal acquaintance. He would have known that the king was not capable, by temperament or by ability, of the kind of forceful, decisive governance that England needed. He would have known that the men around Henry Margaret of Anjou, Somerset, Suffolk, and the others who sought to fill the vacuum created by Henry's passivity were fighting for control in ways that were increasingly dangerous. Edmund served Henry anyway. He served him with what appears to have been genuine loyalty. This is a quality worth honoring in Edmund, the quality of faithfulness to a person he genuinely liked and genuinely cared about, even in the clear-eyed recognition that this person was probably not adequate to the role he had been born into. Edmund was not, as far as we can tell, a cynic. He believed in something. Whether that something was the Lancastrian cause in a large political sense, or whether it was more personal, his connection to his half-brother, his loyalty to the family that had given him his place in the world, we cannot say with certainty, but it was real, and it held until the end. The First Battle of St. Albans, fought on the 22nd of May 1455, was the event that made everything that followed in Edmund's life both more urgent and more dangerous. It was not a large battle. By the standards of the later Wars of the Roses, it was barely a skirmish fought over a few hours in the streets of a market town, with casualties numbered in the dozens rather than the thousands. But its political meaning was enormous. It announced, in the clearest possible terms, that the political crisis of Henry VI's reign had moved beyond negotiation into a new and frightening territory. York and his allies, including the Nevilles, the powerful northern family whose support was crucial to the Yorkist cause, had gathered their forces at St. Albans. The royal party, including Henry VI himself, was present. The confrontation began as what it usually did in this period, a standoff, with each side sending messages and demands, attempting to achieve through negotiation what they might otherwise need to achieve through violence. But something went wrong. The negotiations broke down. The Yorkist forces moved into the town. Fighting broke out in the narrow streets. Edmund was not at St. Albans. His role in Wales kept him away from the immediate scene of the confrontation, but the news would have reached him quickly. Henry wounded slightly, in the neck, and captured by the Yorkists. Two of the principal Lancastrian noblemen dead. The Duke of Somerset, whose rivalry with York had been one of the primary drivers of the whole crisis, killed in the fighting. The Earl of Northumberland, a great northern lord, also killed, the king in Yorkist hands, being managed rather than governing. This was the world that Edmund was now operating in, a world in which the king he served had just been physically captured by forces that styled themselves as reformers, but looked, from a Lancastrian perspective, very much like rebels. A world in which the political situation had crossed a threshold that made comfortable accommodation between the two sides increasingly difficult to imagine. It was in this world, in the summer and autumn following St. Albans, that Edmund was sent to Wales with Margaret, with the explicit mission of holding Wales for Lancaster. The urgency was real, the stakes were real, and the risk, as events would very quickly demonstrate, was also entirely real. Margaret Beaufort gave birth to Henry Tudor on the 28th of January 1457 at Pembroke Castle in southwest Wales. She was 13 years old and 8 months. The baby was healthy. His mother very nearly was not. Pembroke Castle was, and is, a remarkable place. It sits on a promontory of rock above the Pembroke River. Its great round keep rising tall and solid against the Welsh sky. Its walls thick and ancient and built to last. It was, in January of 1457, the stronghold of Jasper Tudor, Earl of Pembroke, Edmund's brother, Margaret's brother-in-law. Now suddenly, the most important protector that Margaret and her unborn child had in the world. Jasper had taken Margaret into his care after Edmund's death, brought her to the safety of Pembroke, provided the protection of his castle and his authority while she waited for the child to come. Think of Margaret in those weeks of waiting, 13 years old, in a Welsh castle, in the middle of winter, a widow barely 2 months after her wedding had been completed, carrying a child she had not asked for, in a body that was not really ready for what was happening to it, surrounded, presumably, by women midwives, ladies of the household, experienced women who had attended births before and who knew what was coming, but also, fundamentally, alone, in the way that every woman who has ever labored to bring a child into the world is alone. The experience is yours and only yours. No one can take it from you or carry it for you. And Margaret's experience of that birth was, by her own later testimony, extreme. She described it in later life as a labor that almost killed her. She seems to have suffered damage from it that affected her health and her capacity to bear children in the years that followed. She had no other children, through 3 subsequent marriages, in all her remaining decades of life. The child who was born was large relative to her small frame. The labor was long and difficult. The danger was real and immediate. Henry Tudor was born. He was alive, and he was healthy, a remarkable and precious outcome given the circumstances. Margaret survived too, though she carried the marks of that labor with her for the rest of her life. And in the cold rooms of Pembroke Castle, with the winter outside and Jasper Tudor watching over them, the two of them, mother and child, widow and fatherless boy, began their life together. Henry was Edmund Tudor's son. He had his father's blood, the Welsh blood of Owen Tudor of Anglesey, the French royal blood of Catherine of Valois. All the complicated, unexpected, improbable mixture that Edmund had carried. He had his mother's blood too, the Beaufort blood, John of Gaunt's legacy, the contested but real connection to the royal line of England. He was, in his own small person, a convergence of bloodlines and claims and possibilities that made him, from the very moment of his birth, a figure of genuine political significance. He did not know any of this, of course. He was a baby. He needed feeding and warmth and the close physical presence of his mother and the other women who cared for him. He slept and woke and cried, and grew in the ordinary way of babies, entirely unaware of the extraordinary weight of history that had already settled on his small shoulders. Margaret watched him. Margaret, who had come so close to dying in bringing him into the world, who had lost his father before the birth could even happen, who was 13 years old and alone and responsible for this child. Margaret watched him with the particular focused intensity of someone who has already paid a very high price and is absolutely determined that the payment was not in vain. She was, from the very beginning, devoted to Henry with a force and a completeness that would define her entire remaining life. Every decision she made for the next 30 years would be shaped by this devotion. Every risk she took, every alliance she forged, every long, patient year of waiting, all of it was for him. Jasper Tudor was present in these first months. Edmund's brother, dark-haired, capable, deeply loyal to the Lancastrian cause, was the closest thing to a father figure that Henry would know in his earliest years. Jasper had his own reasons for caring about Margaret and the baby. They were his family, his connection to his dead brother, his responsibility. But he also seems to have developed a genuine affection for the child, an affection that would prove to be enduring and absolutely crucial in the difficult years ahead. Jasper would be, in the years to come, the person who kept Henry alive when all the forces of political fortune seemed to be conspiring against him. Edmund was dead, but what he had made this child, this convergence of bloodlines and possibilities, was alive and growing and beginning to make its way in the world. The England that Henry Tudor was born into in January 1457 was an England that was coming apart. The political tensions that had been building since the middle of the 1440s, that had boiled over into violence at St. Albans in 1455 and had continued to simmer and threaten since, were moving toward a full-scale rupture. The Wars of the Roses, as the conflict between the House of Lancaster and the House of York came to be known, though the name was not used at the time, were about to enter their most violent and chaotic phase. Henry VI was still technically king, but his hold on power was increasingly tenuous. His mental collapses, which returned periodically throughout the 1450s, leaving him incapacitated, and the government in chaos, had severely damaged royal authority. The Lancastrian cause was being defended with increasing desperation by Queen Margaret of Anjou, Henry's formidable and politically astute wife, who had none of her husband's passivity or instability, and who was determined to protect both the crown and her son, Prince Edward's inheritance. Richard, Duke of York, continued his campaign to establish his own supremacy. York's position that his genealogical claim to the throne was actually stronger than Henry VI's was not frivolous. Through his descent from Edward III's second son, Lionel of Clarence, Henry VI's Lancastrian line descended from Edward's third son, John of Gaunt. York could argue that the Lancastrian claim to the throne had been built on a wrong turn of history that needed to be corrected. Whether this argument was right was a matter of passionate dispute. The entire kingdom was increasingly sorting itself into those who found it compelling and those who rejected it. By 1460, the conflict had escalated significantly. There were more battles at Blore Heath, at Northampton, at Wakefield. The casualties were mounting. Great lords were dying. England was being torn apart by the competing claims and the violence that those claims had released. Richard of York himself died at the Battle of Wakefield in December 1460. He was killed trying to break out of his castle at Sandal, outnumbered and outmaneuvered by a Lancastrian army. His head was placed above the gates of York, the city, reportedly with a paper crown mocking his pretensions. It was a brutal piece of theatre that said everything about how far past ordinary political negotiation the conflict had travelled. But York's death did not end the Yorkist cause. It transferred it to his son, Edward, who was 18 years old, enormously tall, physically imposing, politically astute beyond his years, and absolutely determined to pursue his father's claim. Edward would prove to be a far more formidable military commander and political operator than his father had ever been. In the early weeks of 1461, the tempo of conflict accelerated. There was another Battle of St. Albans, the second one in which Queen Margaret's Lancastrian army defeated the Yorkists and recovered Henry VI, who had been in Yorkist custody. And then, almost immediately, Edward of York marched on London. The city, which had been increasingly favourable to the Yorkist cause, connected to it through trade and financial interests, opened its gates to him. Edward entered London, and in March 1461, he was proclaimed King Edward IV. The Lancastrian line, the line that Edmund Tudor had served, that had given him his earldom, that his brother Jasper was still fighting for, had lost the throne. The political earthquake that this represented cannot be overstated. Henry VI, who had been king since he was 9 months old, was no longer the king. He was a fugitive. His wife and son were in the north, then fleeing to Scotland. The entire network of Lancastrian lords, who had organised their careers and their loyalties around the Lancastrian crown, suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of history. Jasper Tudor was among them. He continued to fight for the Lancastrian cause even after Edward's proclamation, raising forces in Wales, engaging in military actions, refusing to accept the new order. He was a man of stubborn loyalty, Jasper, a quality that his brother Edmund had also possessed and that would define the whole Tudor family's relationship with the concept of faithfulness. And in Pembroke Castle, a 4-year-old boy named Henry Tudor was about to have his entire world turned upside down. In 1461, following Edward IV's seizure of the throne, Pembroke Castle fell to the Yorkist cause. William Herbert, the same William Herbert who had captured Edmund Tudor at Carmarthen 5 years earlier, who had put Edmund in the castle where he died, was now in the ascendant. He was a loyal Yorkist, rewarded for his loyalty by Edward IV with lands and titles in Wales. And among the prizes of the new Yorkist order was Pembroke Castle and the custody of the boy who lived within its walls. Henry Tudor, aged 4, was taken from his mother and placed under the wardship of William Herbert and his wife Anne Devereux. This was not the only disruption. Margaret Beaufort was no longer in a position to shelter with Jasper in Pembroke. The political landscape had changed too dramatically. She needed to find her own way forward in a world that had just been turned inside out. The separation of Margaret and Henry was devastating. She had built her entire emotional and practical life around this child, this boy who was all she had left of Edmund Tudor, this child whose birth had nearly killed her, and whose welfare she had already pledged herself to with absolute devotion. And now, he was taken from her. This was not the last time the world would try to separate Margaret from her purpose. She was a woman who would be separated from her son again and again over the decades that followed by politics, by geography, by the arbitrary cruelties of a system that gave other people legal authority over her and over him. But she was also, as we have begun to see, a woman who did not simply accept what was taken from her. She adapted, she waited, she found the long game and played it. Henry, at Pembroke under the Herbert wardship, grew up in an interesting situation. William Herbert and Anne Devereux do not seem to have been unkind to their young ward. Herbert was a Welshman himself, born into the Welsh gentry, risen through service to the Yorkist cause, and he seems to have treated Henry with a degree of genuine care. Henry received his education under the Herbert household's supervision. He learned to read and write. He was exposed to the world of noble management and governance in the same experiential way that all young men of this class were educated. Herbert was apparently considering marrying Henry to one of his own daughters when the time came, but William Herbert's ascent was brutally interrupted. He was captured at the Battle of Edgecote in 1469 during an uprising against Edward IV and executed. The sudden death of his guardian plunged Henry's situation into renewed uncertainty. This period of uncertainty, the late 1460s, was a particularly chaotic time in English politics. Edward IV was facing serious opposition within his own camp. His relationship with his former mentor, the powerful Earl of Warwick, often called the Kingmaker by later historians, had broken down catastrophically. Warwick had concluded that Edward was no longer manageable and had switched sides, had become a Lancastrian supporter, had worked to restore Henry VI to the throne in what is called the readeption of 1470 to 71, a brief period in which Henry VI was actually placed back on the throne of England, while Edward fled to exile in Burgundy. During the readaptation, Jasper Tudor came back. He came back to Wales, he came back to Pembroke, and he came back to his nephew Henry. For a few extraordinary months, in 1470 to 71, the wheel of fortune had turned. Jasper was once again the Earl in Wales. Henry Tudor was again in Lancastrian hands. And the future, a Lancastrian future, a future in which the legitimate line of Lancaster was restored to its rightful place, seemed briefly, tantalizingly possible. It did not last. In the spring of 1471, Edward IV returned from Burgundy with an army. He was not a man who accepted defeat quietly. He moved fast, gathered support as he marched through England, and within weeks had reasserted control with devastating efficiency. At the Battle of Barnet in April 1471, the Earl of Warwick was killed. At the Battle of Tewkesbury in May, the Lancastrian cause suffered its final, annihilating blow on English soil. The young Prince Edward, Henry VI's son and heir, was killed in the fighting or in its immediate aftermath, and Henry VI himself, imprisoned in the Tower of London, died that same night. Whether by natural causes or, as most historians believe, by deliberate killing, Henry VI was gone. The Lancastrian royal line, the direct line, was extinguished. Jasper Tudor understood immediately what this meant. The direct Lancastrian line was dead, but there was still Henry Tudor. There was still Margaret Beaufort's son, Edmund's son, Owen's grandson, a boy of 14 who carried Beaufort blood and Tudor blood and who was now, by the ruthless arithmetic of dynastic politics, one of the most significant Lancastrian claimants still alive, which meant he was also one of the most endangered people in England. Edward IV would not rest easy with a potential Lancastrian claimant growing up in Wales. The Tudor boy needed to be captured, controlled, neutralized, and Jasper knew it. Jasper moved with his nephew to the coast of Wales. They intended, perhaps, only a short exile, a crossing to France or Brittany until the political winds changed, a period of waiting that they might have imagined would be measured in months rather than years. They set sail. The sea, as it so often does in Welsh history, played its part in the story. Storms and unfavorable winds took them off course. They did not land in France. They landed, after a difficult crossing, in Brittany. The Duchy of Brittany was a semi-independent state on the northwestern tip of France, French-speaking, French-adjacent, but with its own duke and its own traditions of autonomy. Duke Francis II of Brittany was a cautious, politically astute man who recognized that the two Tudor refugees who arrived on his shores had potential value. They were Lancastrian claimants. They might be useful bargaining chips with England. They might be useful allies if the political situation in England changed. He kept them comfortable, housed them well, gave them appropriate allowances, treated them with the respect due to men of their rank, while also making clear that they were not entirely free to come and go as they pleased. They were guests. They were also, in a politely unspoken way, hostages. Henry Tudor would spend the next 14 years in Brittany. 14 years. He went into exile at 14 years old. He would not return to England until he was 28. Those 14 years, the years in which a boy became a young man, in which adolescence gave way to adulthood, in which character and judgment and the qualities that would define a king were formed, were spent in a foreign duchy, in a kind of gilded captivity, waiting for a future that seemed, in the darker moments, genuinely impossible. He had been born without a father. Edmund Tudor had died 8 weeks before he drew his first breath, and now, in exile in Brittany, he was also separated from his mother, the one person who had been the constant of his life, who had devoted every resource at her disposal to his welfare. Margaret was in England. Henry was in Brittany. Between them stretched the sea and the width of 2 kingdoms, and the entire hostile weight of Yorkist political power. But Margaret was not idle. Margaret Beaufort, in the years after 1471, demonstrated the full range of her extraordinary qualities. She had been separated from her son. The cause she believed in, the Lancastrian cause, the rightful Lancastrian inheritance, had been crushed, its royal line extinguished. The man who sat on the throne of England was a Yorkist who had good reason to be wary of the Tudor family. Her son was in exile across the sea, and the prospects of his return seemed remote. She did not give up. She did not collapse. She did not lose herself in grief, or in the kind of passive endurance that might be forgiven in someone who had already been through everything she had been through. She played the long game, with patience, with intelligence, with the particular quality of focused, strategic determination that had been her defining characteristic since she was old enough to develop one. In 1458 or 1459, Margaret had married for the second time to Sir Henry Stafford, the second son of the Duke of Buckingham. This marriage was, by the standards of Margaret's life, a reasonably happy one. Henry Stafford was a gentle, decent man, apparently genuinely fond of his wife, and the marriage seems to have been more companionate and more personally satisfying than the child marriage to Edmund Tudor. They did not have children. The damage from Henry Tudor's birth appears to have made Margaret unable to conceive again, but they had each other, and some degree of real warmth. Stafford died in 1471, in the aftermath of the Battle of Barnet, wounded in that engagement. Dying of his wounds some months later, Margaret was widowed for the second time at 28 years old. Her third marriage, in 1472 or thereabouts, was to Thomas Stanley, a powerful nobleman who was, politically, something of a master of the careful middle path. Stanley was not a passionate Lancastrian or a passionate Yorkist. He was an enormously capable political survivor who had managed to remain relevant and prosperous through all the upheavals of the previous decades by a combination of strategic flexibility and sheer good judgment about when to commit, when to hold back. He had lands in the northwest of England and was enormously influential there. He was, in short, the kind of husband who could provide Margaret with security, protection, and access to the networks of power she needed, even if he could not provide the personal warmth that Stafford had given her. Margaret used her marriage to Stanley well. Not cynically, she was too principled a person for pure cynicism, but intelligently. She maintained her household in England. She built her network of contacts. She stayed in communication with her son across the sea, sending letters and money and encouragement when she could manage it. She cultivated relationships with people who might, at some future point, be useful to Henry's cause. She waited. The waiting was not passive. She was thinking, always thinking. The question of succession, of who would rule England when Edward IV died, or if he died without a strong succession, was always in the background of English politics. Edward had sons, but they were young, and English history had shown repeatedly that young heirs in uncertain political situations were dangerously vulnerable. Margaret was watching, calculating, imagining the possible futures and working out which of them might create the space for her son to step into. Edward IV died on the 9th of April, 1483. He was 40 years old, not old by modern standards, but not young for a man who had lived as hard as Edward had. He had campaigned, feasted, loved, fought, and governed with an energy and physicality that took a real toll. He had also, in his later years, grown heavy and somewhat less decisive than the brilliant young king who had seized the throne in 1461. His death was, for many people, unexpected, sudden enough to create immediate political crisis. He left behind two sons, Edward, Prince of Wales, who was 12 years old, and Richard, Duke of York, who was 9. He left behind a complicated court full of factions and rivalries, and he left behind his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who was about to make one of the most dramatic and controversial moves in all of English history. Richard of Gloucester acted quickly after his brother's death. He intercepted the young King Edward V on his way to London for his coronation. He took control of the boy. He had the boy's maternal Woodville relatives, the family of Edward IV's queen, Elizabeth Woodville, arrested. He placed young Edward V in the Tower of London. He brought the younger boy, Richard of York, there too, claiming it was for their protection. And then, in June and July of 1483, Richard had himself declared King Richard III on the basis of a claim that his brother, Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, had been invalid. and that the boys were therefore illegitimate. The two boys, the princes in the tower, as history has known them, were never publicly seen again. Whether they were killed, and if so, by whose order and in what circumstances, has been one of the greatest mysteries and controversies in English history for over 500 years. What is clear is that they disappeared, and that Richard III's seizure of the throne was built on their disappearance. Richard's coup, for that, is what it was. However, he dressed it in legal language, transformed the political landscape of England almost overnight. Many of those who might have been comfortable with a Yorkist succession in the person of a legitimate young Edward V were not comfortable with this. The Duke of Buckingham, one of Richard's initial supporters, turned against him almost immediately, raised a rebellion in the autumn of 1483, and was captured and executed. Buckingham's rebellion failed, but it demonstrated that Richard's hold on power was not secure, that there were significant numbers of powerful people who did not accept the legitimacy of what he had done, and Margaret Beaufort had been working. She had been in contact with Elizabeth Woodville, the former queen, now with her daughters but without her sons. She had been in contact with the exiles in Brittany. She had been building, quietly and carefully, the coalition that might give Henry Tudor a realistic chance of claiming the throne that she believed was rightfully his. The moment was approaching. After 14 years of exile, the world was finally creating the conditions that Margaret had been waiting and working for. In the years of his exile in Brittany, Henry Tudor grew from a 14-year-old boy into a young man of 28. He was shaped by those years in ways that would define his kingship, by the experience of dependence and vulnerability, of waiting without certainty, of maintaining hope in circumstances that frequently offered very little objective reason for it. He learned patience. He learned discretion. He learned how to read people and situations with great care, how to trust cautiously and reward loyalty precisely, how to keep his own counsel. He was educated, in the broad sense, not the formal scholarly education of a university, but the practical education of a young man of rank who moved in the circles of a sophisticated ducal court, who had access to books and to literate company, who absorbed the political and diplomatic culture of Brittany and France in those years. He spoke French fluently, a natural acquisition for someone living in a French-speaking environment for 14 years. He remained deeply shaped by his Welsh heritage, by the language and the stories of his father's people, by the sense of Welsh identity that Jasper Tudor maintained through all the years of exile. Jasper was always there, always beside him, Edmund's brother, who had stepped into the gap that Edmund's death had created and filled it with a faithfulness that was, over 14 years of difficult exile, genuinely extraordinary. Jasper never abandoned Henry. He never made his own peace with the Yorkist regime at the cost of leaving his nephew behind. He sacrificed his own potential comfortable accommodation with the powers that were in England in order to stay beside Edmund's son and wait for the future that they both believed was coming. The relationship between Jasper and Henry is one of the most touching shadow stories within the larger shadow story of this family. Jasper never had children of his own, or at least none that history has recorded. He gave the protective devotion that might have gone to his own sons to Edmund's boy instead. And Henry, who had never known his father, had in Jasper something of what a father might have given him: stability, protection, the example of a man who chose loyalty over safety and maintained it across decades. After Buckingham's rebellion in 1483, and after the failure of an earlier attempt by Henry to land in England that autumn his fleet was scattered by storms, an early and frustrating example of the weather's interest in Tudor history, the planning continued. Alliances were forming. Money was being raised. Supporters in England were making their positions clear, quietly, to each other and to Henry's agents. The argument for Henry's claim was being shaped and sharpened. He was the Lancastrian claimant, the son of Edmund Tudor, grandson of Owen Tudor and Katherine of Valois, descended through his mother from John of Gaunt. He would, if he became king, marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, and unite the two warring houses. The Red Rose and the White Rose, the Lancaster and York, joined in marriage and in the person of a new dynasty. It was a compelling vision. It was also, in the cold light of practical politics, the best available option for a significant number of people who were uncomfortable with Richard III, but needed somewhere to put their loyalty. Margaret Beaufort worked tirelessly to build and maintain the coalition. She was still, officially, married to Thomas Stanley, and Stanley was still in England, still apparently serving Richard III's government, still maintaining the careful neutrality that was his political style. The relationship between Margaret and Stanley in this period was complex. She was plotting against the king to whom her husband was nominally loyal. He knew it, or suspected it, or was at minimum aware enough to be making very careful calculations about which way to jump when the moment came. Margaret navigated this with extraordinary skill, maintaining her marriage, maintaining the surface of ordinary domestic life, while working the underground channels of conspiracy and alliance. In 1484, Richard III discovered enough of what Margaret was doing to take punitive action. He confiscated her lands and put her in the custody of Thomas Stanley, a somewhat paradoxical punishment, given Stanley's ambiguous loyalties. But Richard could not afford to execute the wife of one of England's most powerful magnates without completely breaking with Stanley, whose support he still needed. He chose the lesser punishment. Margaret accepted it and continued, within the constraints of Stanley's household, to do what she could. The year 1485 arrived, and with it, the moment that Margaret had been waiting for. Henry Tudor left Brittany in the summer of 1485. He had, by this point, secured the support and resources he needed: French backing, a small but real army, the promise of additional Welsh and English support when he landed. He sailed for Wales, the country of his father's family, the country where the name Tudor meant something, where Owen and Jasper and the whole Welsh identity of his lineage might resonate with the people he needed to join him. He landed at Mill Bay in Pembrokeshire on the 7th of August 1485. He was 28 years old. He had not seen England since he was a child. He had not seen his mother since he was 14. He stepped onto Welsh soil and began the march that would either put him on the throne of England or end his life. Word spread ahead of him as he marched. The route through Wales gave him the opportunity to gather Welsh support, and gather it he did. Though the numbers were at first modest, Welsh men joined his army. He marched north through Wales and then into England, moving quickly, staying disciplined, watching carefully for signs of how the great lords would respond. The key figure, the great unknown in all the calculations, was Thomas Stanley, Margaret's husband. The man who had enormous military power in the northwest of England, who had been nominally loyal to Richard III, but who had given Margaret Beaufort's son quiet encouragement through back channels. Stanley and his brother Sir William Stanley each commanded substantial forces. If they came down on Richard's side, Henry was in serious trouble. If they joined Henry, or even if they simply waited until the battle was decided before committing, Henry's chances were dramatically better. Richard III knew this. He had, in a move that revealed how little he trusted Stanley, taken Stanley's son George as a hostage insurance against Stanley switching sides. Stanley knew that if he moved against Richard, his son's life might be forfeit. The armies came together on the 22nd of August 1485 at a place near Market Bosworth in Leicestershire, the Battle of Bosworth Field. Richard III led his army from a position of initial numerical advantage. He had more men, he had artillery, he had the established authority of a king who had been on the throne for 2 years. What he did not have, as it turned out, was the unambiguous loyalty of everyone nominally under his command. Henry's army engaged Richard's. The Stanley forces waited on the flanks, positioned where they could intervene on either side. And then, in a move that has been debated and analysed by historians for 5 centuries, Richard III appears to have made a dramatic tactical decision. He saw Henry Tudor at some distance, with a relatively small escort. He charged, personally, at the head of his cavalry, in a direct assault on the Lancastrian claimant. What Richard was attempting, killing Henry directly, ending the battle by ending its figurehead, was bold. It was also reckless, and it gave the Stanleys the clarity they had been waiting for. As Richard's cavalry charge began, and Henry's immediate escorts scrambled to protect him, the Stanley forces committed. Sir William Stanley, at least, moved his men to support Henry. Richard's charge became a trap. His cavalry, separated from the main body of his army, found themselves surrounded. Richard III fought, by all accounts, with genuine personal bravery, refusing to flee, even when the situation was clearly lost, pressing forward in what became a last stand rather than a tactical withdrawal. He was killed. His crown, the plain gold circlet he wore in battle rather than the great crown of England, fell from his head in the fighting and was found afterward, allegedly in a hawthorn bush. Thomas Stanley picked it up and he placed it on Henry Tudor's head. In that moment, on that muddy field in Leicestershire, on the 22nd of August 1485, the dreams and the suffering and the long waiting of an entire generation reached their fulfillment. Henry Tudor, son of Edmund Tudor and Margaret Beaufort, grandson of Owen Tudor and Katherine of Valois, was King of England. The news travelled. By the time it reached Margaret Beaufort, who was somewhere in England, who had spent the days of the battle in prayer, by her own later testimony, prostrate before her God, asking for the outcome she had worked toward for so long, it must have felt like something beyond what words could easily contain. Her son was king. Edmund Tudor's son was king. The boy who had been born in Pembroke Castle in January 1457, 8 weeks after his father's death, to a 13-year-old mother, alone in a Welsh winter, that boy was King of England. Margaret wept, it was said, when she received the news. She wept and could not stop weeping, having contained herself through all the years of planning and waiting and managing and praying, having maintained her composure through decades of setback and uncertainty and separation. She apparently broke open with feeling when the thing she had worked for finally happened. This is perhaps the most human moment in her entire extraordinary story. Not the strategist, not the politician, not the formidable organizer of conspiracies and alliances, but simply a mother, learning that her child was safe and triumphant. After years in which he had been neither, Henry was crowned King Henry VII on the 30th of October 1485 at Westminster Abbey. He rode through London to the cheers of the crowd. He received the homage of the great lords. He sat on the throne of England and looked out at the kingdom that was now his to govern. He was extraordinary as a king in many ways. He was cautious, careful, patient qualities formed in those 14 years of exile that now translated into an extraordinarily stable and financially capable form of governance. He was not a war maker in the tradition of Henry V. He was a consolidator, a builder, a man who understood that the kingdom needed peace and order and sound finances more than it needed glory. He worked to end the private armies and the factional violence that had torn England apart for 30 years. He cultivated trade. He enforced royal authority with consistent firmness. He was suspicious, sometimes to a paranoid degree, of threats to his position, which was understandable given everything he had been through. But he was also capable of wise and generous governance when the circumstances called for it. He fulfilled the promise he had made before the invasion. He married Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, uniting the Lancaster and York lines in the marriage bed and producing children who carried both bloodlines. Their son, Arthur, was born in 1486. Their son, Henry the future Henry VIII, was born in 1491. Their daughter Margaret was born in 1489 and would become Queen of Scotland. The Tudor dynasty was planted firmly in the soil of English kingship, and it would flower for over 100 years. Owen Tudor, Edmund's father, had been executed after the Battle of Mortimer's Cross in February 1461, a death that deserves its own whispered moment here. Owen had gone on fighting for the Lancastrian cause even in his old age, and when he was captured, he was beheaded at Hereford. The story goes that he maintained his composure through the whole terrible business, saying something to the effect that the head that had once lain on Queen Katherine's lap had come to this. It is the kind of ending that seems almost too poignant for history to have arranged deliberately, and yet here it is. Owen had started the whole story. He had been the Welsh squire who dared to love a queen, and he died for the cause that his love had set in motion. Jasper Tudor lived to see his nephew crowned, He was created Duke of Bedford after Bosworth, a great title, a richly deserved one, a reward for the loyalty and the sacrifice of 14 years in exile. He married Catherine Woodville, widowed Duchess of Buckingham, and lived out his later years in comfort and honour. He had never abandoned Edmund's son, not once, not through all of it. He deserved the peace that the Tudor triumph finally gave him. Margaret Beaufort was given, after Bosworth, the recognition that she had earned through decades of determined, patient, courageous work. She was created a femme sole, given legal independence, unusual for a married woman in this period, that allowed her to own property and conduct legal business in her own name. She was one of the most respected and powerful women in England, and she used that power as she had always used whatever power was available to her, purposefully, carefully, in service of what she believed to be right. She founded Christ's College and St. John's College at Cambridge. She translated devotional texts. She established schools. She was a patron of the early English printing press, supporting the printer William Caxton in his extraordinary work of making books available to a wider public. She outlived her son, the King, dying on the 29th of June 1509, just 5 weeks after Henry VII himself. She had survived everything. She had seen everything. She had shaped everything. And Edmund Tudor, who had never lived long enough to know what he had made, who had died in that cold castle before his child was born, rested in the church of the Grey Friars at Carmarthen, where he had been buried after his death from plague in November 1456. His tomb did not stay there permanently. It would eventually be moved, and the full story of where his remains ended up is a story for another night. But his shadow stayed. His shadow stretched across the whole of Tudor England, across every year of Henry VII's careful, consolidating reign, across the enormous drama of Henry VIII, across the brief reign of Edward VI, and the troubled reign of Mary, and the extraordinary reign of Elizabeth I. Edmund's shadow was in all of it. The dynasty he had founded, in the most literal sense by the act of fathering the child who became its first king, lasted from 1485 to 1603. Over 100 years of Tudor rule, over 100 years of shadow cast by a young man who died at 26 in a Welsh castle and never saw any of it. In part 4, our final part, we will gather all of this together. We will think about Edmund's legacy in the fullest sense. We will follow the long reach of his shadow across the century his dynasty shaped. We will say goodbye to him properly. Rest now, dear traveller. Part 4 is the end of the journey, and it will be there when you are ready. Pembroke Castle, where Henry Tudor was born and where Margaret Beaufort spent the most extreme weeks of her young life, is worth knowing more fully. It is still there. It still stands on its rock promontory above the Pembroke River, its great circular keep over 75 feet high, with walls 16 feet thick, at the base rising against the Welsh sky, in a way that suggests exactly what it was built to suggest: permanence, strength, the absolute refusal to yield to any force the world might bring against it. The Norman earls who built Pembroke chose their site with military genius. The rock on which the castle sits is almost entirely surrounded by water, by the river on 3 sides, accessible only from the town side, which was itself defended by walls and gates. It was, in the language of medieval military architecture, one of the most defensible positions in Wales. This was the place Jasper Tudor called home as Earl of Pembroke, and in the autumn and winter of 1456 and 1457, it was the place where Margaret Beaufort waited for the birth, for the news of Edmund, for the overwhelming reality of everything that had happened to arrive in full. We have already spoken about the birth itself, about the danger of it, about the 13-year-old body that was required to do something it was not truly ready to do, about the labor that Margaret later described as the defining physical ordeal of her life. Let us stay there a little longer, not out of a desire to dwell on suffering, but because it matters, because Margaret's survival of that January night was itself a kind of miracle, a small, private, utterly uncelebrated miracle that the historical record notes almost in passing, as if the near death of a 13-year-old in childbirth was simply one of the unremarkable facts of medieval life. It was not unremarkable, not to Margaret, not to the women around her who managed the birth and held her through the hardest hours and watched with fear as the labor progressed and the outcome remained uncertain, not to Jasper, who was somewhere in or near the castle and who understood, as a man who had just lost his brother, exactly what it would mean to also lose his brother's wife and unborn child. The weight of that night pressed on everyone in Pembroke Castle with a force that the calm language of historical records cannot fully convey. And then it was over. Henry was alive. Margaret was alive. The thread of the story held. In the weeks and months that followed the birth, Margaret was recovering slowly, carefully, in the cold rooms of Pembroke Castle through the Welsh winter. She would have been unable to move freely for some time. The physical damage from the birth needed time to heal. She was dependent, in a way she had not been since very early childhood, on the care of others, on the women of the household, on the attention of whatever medical knowledge Jasper could provide access to, on the basic elements of rest and warmth and adequate food that recovery required. Henry was a newborn, needing the constant physical care that newborns require. Whether Margaret nursed him herself, or whether a wet nurse was provided, as was common in great households of this period, we do not know. But the bond between them, from the earliest days, was clearly intense and lasting. She had nearly died to bring him into the world. She had lost his father before he was born. He was all that remained of Edmund, and he was hers, and the devotion she felt for him was forged in those first weeks in Pembroke with the particular intensity of something that has been paid for at enormous cost. When Henry Tudor was placed in the wardship of William Herbert and his wife Anne Devereux after the Yorkist takeover of 1461, he was approximately 4 years old. He was taken from Pembroke to Raglan Castle in Monmouthshire, a grand, powerful fortification that was the centre of Herbert's Welsh domains and that was, in many respects, one of the finest castle residences in Wales. Raglan Castle was not the grim military fortress that the word castle might conjure. By the mid-15th century, the castle had been significantly developed by Herbert into something more palatial than purely military, a residence of considerable luxury, with well-appointed rooms, fine furnishings, and the kind of cultural life that an ambitious and wealthy nobleman of the period cultivated as a marker of status and aspiration. Herbert was himself a man of considerable personal refinement, Welsh in his origins but thoroughly integrated into the English noble world, a man who patronized poets and musicians, and who ran his household according to the standards of the most sophisticated English and Welsh gentry. Henry grew up in this environment. From 4 years old, he was a Herbert household child eating at Herbert's tables, learning from Herbert's tutors, absorbing the values and skills of Herbert's world. He learned to ride. He learned to manage weapons, the sword, the lance, the skills of martial life that were expected of any young nobleman. He received a formal education in the subjects that a household of Herbert's level would provide: Latin, some French, the religious knowledge that was essential in a profoundly Catholic world, the basics of estate management and governance. Herbert's wife, Anne Devereux, seems to have been particularly kind to Henry. Some accounts suggest that she treated him almost as one of her own children, that the Herberts, who had children of their own, including daughters who might eventually marry their ward, integrated Henry into the family in ways that gave him something, at least, of the domestic warmth that his particular circumstances had denied him. He had a home, of a sort. He had consistency, of a kind. He was not abandoned or mistreated, but he was separated from his mother. And the awareness of that separation, the knowledge that there was a person who loved him absolutely, from whom he had been taken, who was somewhere in England doing everything she could to maintain connection with him, was part of his consciousness from an early age. Margaret sent gifts when she could. She negotiated access when the political situation permitted. She maintained the connection at whatever level was available to her, and Henry knew it. He grew up knowing that he was not forgotten, that his mother had not given up on him, that someone in the world was absolutely devoted to the project of his survival and eventual flourishing. This knowledge, the security of being unconditionally loved by at least one person in an uncertain world, may be part of what gave Henry the particular quality of inner steadiness that he showed in later years. He was not, by temperament, a man who panicked or despaired. He was patient. He could wait. He could hold his nerve through circumstances that would have broken less stable people. The Herbert years, combined with his mother's relentless devotion, may have been part of the formation of this quality. When Jasper and Henry finally arrived in Brittany after their storm-driven crossing of 1471, they landed in a world that was familiar enough to be navigable but foreign enough to require significant adjustment. Brittany was a sophisticated and cultured duchy, French-speaking, with a court that followed the fashions and intellectual currents of the wider European world. Duke Francis II maintained a court that was genuinely cultivated, interested in learning, in music, in the arts of good governance, in the complex diplomatic game of maintaining Breton independence in relation to the larger kingdoms of France and England that pressed on it from either side. Henry and Jasper were settled in comfortable quarters appropriate to their rank. They had allowances provided by the Duke money to maintain their household, to dress and eat and live at the level their status required. They were not imprisoned, exactly. They could move about, attend court, maintain the social life of men of their rank. But they could not leave without the Duke's permission. And the Duke's permission was subject to political considerations that changed as the relationship between Brittany, France, and England shifted over the years. Henry learned French fluently in these years, an acquisition that came naturally to someone living in a French-speaking environment from the age of 14. He read widely. Apparently Brittany had access to the books and manuscripts that were circulating through the European learned world, including the new humanist scholarship that was transforming intellectual culture in the late 15th century. He observed the court life around him with the attentive eyes of someone who knew that this knowledge of how courts worked, how diplomacy was conducted, how power was managed and projected, might one day be enormously important to him. He remained, throughout these 14 years, remarkably focused. He did not lose himself in the pleasures that a comfortable exile might have offered. He did not drink heavily, did not gamble destructively, did not involve himself in the kind of romantic adventures that young men in his position sometimes use to fill the emptiness of waiting. He was waiting for something specific. He knew what he was waiting for, and he kept himself ready, maintained by Jasper's steadiness and his mother's letters and his own deep conviction that the waiting would eventually end. He was also, in these years, becoming the person who would be king. Every year in Brittany was a year of formation, of watching and learning and thinking, of developing the particular qualities that would make him, once he finally reached England, a formidable and effective ruler. The patience forged in exile, the caution forged by years of political uncertainty, the financial prudence forged by the experience of depending on the generosity of a foreign duke, the understanding of how alliances work, how loyalty must be earned and maintained, how the promise of something must be kept or it means nothing. All of this was being built in the quiet years by the Breton Sea, in the mind and character of Edmund Tudor's son. Henry Tudor was crowned Henry VII at Westminster Abbey on the 30th of October 1485. He was 28 years old. He had been king, technically, since the moment the crown was placed on his head at Bosworth, or perhaps since the moment Richard III fell from his horse, dead, in the chaos of the charge. These things are rarely exact. What was exact was that a new dynasty had begun, a dynasty that took its name from its Welsh origins. The House of Tudor. Henry VII would reign for 24 years, dying in April 1509, and the reign he built was one of the most quietly remarkable in English history, not remarkable in the dramatic, explosive way of his son Henry VIII, not filled with the kind of theatrical events that make for easy storytelling. Henry VII's achievement was more subtle than that, and in some ways more difficult. He took a kingdom that had been torn apart by 30 years of civil war and rebuilt it. He took a royal authority that had been repeatedly undermined, repeatedly contested, repeatedly demonstrated to be unstable, and reasserted it with patient, methodical, completely determined purpose. He was good with money, extraordinarily good. In fact, by the standards of his era and his predecessors, English kings had a habit of running out of money, of spending what they had on wars and ceremonies, and the keeping up of appearances. then borrowing from merchants and foreign bankers, then failing to repay, then needing to spend more. Henry VII reversed this pattern. He was careful. He was, by the standards of the medieval English court, almost parsimonious. Not mean, exactly, but deeply attentive to his finances, deeply committed to the principle that a king who controlled his own money was a king who controlled his own power. He built up substantial royal reserves. He used the legal tools available to him to reclaim royal rights and revenues that had been lost or neglected during the civil wars. He left his kingdom, at his death, in sound financial condition, something very few of his predecessors had managed. He was also, like his Tudor ancestors, a man who understood the importance of family. He married Elizabeth of York, as promised, in January 1486, 6 months after Bosworth. The marriage brought to an end, at least symbolically and politically, the division between Lancaster and York that had cost so many lives and so much suffering. Elizabeth was a gracious, dignified woman who seems to have managed the transition from Yorkist princess to Tudor queen with remarkable poise. Henry genuinely valued her. She died in 1503, in childbirth, and his grief at her death was, by contemporary accounts, very real. He never remarried. Their children were the living proof of the dynasty's success. Their eldest son, Arthur, born in September 1486, was named deliberately and pointedly for the legendary British king. The name was a declaration of Welsh heritage, a connection to the Arthurian mythology that was so deeply embedded in Welsh cultural memory and that gave the Tudor claim to British kingship a mythic resonance that went beyond mere genealogy. Arthur was created Prince of Wales. He was betrothed, then married, to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess of irreproachable royal lineage, in November 1501. The Tudor dynasty was marrying into the great houses of Europe. The long exile, the years of danger, the precarious position of a claimant without resources, all of that seemed, in the ceremonies and celebrations of Arthur's wedding, like something from a distant and already fading past. And then, in April 1502, Arthur died. He was 15 years old. He had been married for less than 5 months. The cause was probably sweating sickness, another of those terrible epidemic diseases that moved through medieval and early modern populations with sudden and devastating speed. He and Catherine were living at Ludlow Castle in the Welsh Marches when the illness struck, and Arthur was dead within a few weeks. Henry VII's grief at Arthur's death was, if anything, even more devastating than his later grief at Elizabeth's. This was not simply personal loss, though it was that, acutely and deeply. It was the loss of the carefully arranged future, the Prince of Wales, the heir, the proof that the dynasty was secure, gone. What followed what Henry VII did in the aftermath of Arthur's death, how he managed the succession, what decisions he made about the future of Catherine of Aragon, and about his second son Henry, is a story for another night, for another shadow documentary. What matters here, for Edmund's story, is the thing that Arthur's death represents, the persistent fragility of everything, even at the moment of apparent triumph, the uncertainty that runs through all of this, the way in which the shadow that began with Edmund's death in Carmarthen Castle in 1456 continued to fall across the lives of the people who came after him, continued to make the future uncertain, continued to demonstrate that what seemed secure could be shattered in a moment by forces beyond anyone's control. Henry VII mourned Arthur. He refocused. His second son, the boy who would become Henry VIII, was suddenly the heir, suddenly the center of all the dynastic planning and investment that had previously been organized around Arthur. Henry VIII was 11 years old when his brother died. He would become king 7 years later. And what he became the enormous, complex, contradictory, magnificent, terrible figure of Henry VIII was shaped by all the forces that had made the Tudor dynasty possible, including, at the very beginning of everything, Edmund Tudor. Henry VIII is one of the most famous figures in all of European history. He is the king with 6 wives. He is the king who broke with Rome and created the Church of England. He is the king who executed chancellors and friends and ministers and, yes, wives, who used the full machinery of royal power to reshape the religious and political landscape of England in ways that his father, the cautious and careful Henry VII, would never have contemplated. He was also Edmund Tudor's grandson. This is worth sitting with for a moment, in the quiet of this candlelit shadow story. When we look at Henry VIII, at that enormous, red-bearded, magnificent, frightening figure, we are looking at someone who would not have existed without Edmund Tudor. The bloodline ran directly. Owen Tudor and Katherine of Valois produced Edmund. Edmund and Margaret Beaufort produced Henry VII. Henry VII and Elizabeth of York produced Henry VIII. Take any link out of that chain, and the whole thing falls apart. No Edmund, no Henry VII, no Henry VIII, no English Reformation, no Church of England, no dissolution of the monasteries, no English Bible, no 6 wives, no sweeping redefinition of what England was and what it meant to be English. Edmund, who died at 26 in a plague-ridden Welsh castle, never imagining the shape of his shadow, set all of this in motion. Henry VIII came to the throne in 1509, 18 years old, tall and handsome and bursting with energy and ambition, and the particular confidence of someone who has been told since childhood that he is exceptional. He was educated, extraordinarily well educated. In fact, in the humanist tradition that the late 15th and early 16th centuries had made fashionable among the European elite. He could compose music, he could write poetry, he could debate theology. He was genuinely intellectually capable in ways that the simplified image of him as a brutal tyrant can obscure. He was also genuinely brutal at times. The executions of Thomas More, of Anne Boleyn, of Thomas Cromwell, of so many others, were not the actions of a man who was simply following legal procedure with reluctant necessity. They were the actions of a man who had decided that his will was supreme and that those who contradicted it would pay. There is a word for this kind of kingship. It is the shadow side of the authority that Henry VII had worked so hard to reassert. Henry VII had rebuilt royal power through patience and legal process. Henry VIII wielded that rebuilt power with a personal ferocity that his father's careful ghost would surely have watched with horror. Margaret Beaufort, who died in June 1509, just weeks after Henry VII, never saw any of her grandson's reign. She died knowing that the dynasty was secure, that Henry VII was leaving behind an established throne, a stable kingdom, and a healthy successor. She did not live to see what her grandson would do with the inheritance she had spent her life building. Perhaps that was mercy. But Edmund's shadow ran through all of it. The Welsh blood that Owen had carried from Anglesey, that Catherine had mixed with her French royal inheritance, that Edmund had passed to Henry VII, and that Henry VII had passed to Henry VIII. That blood was in Henry VIII's veins. The Tudor name, which had started as the English rendering of a Welsh patronymic, now sat on the greatest throne in Europe. The name Tudor, which Owen Tudor had carried across the border from Anglesey to England, which had been the name of a family of modest Welsh gentry, that name was now known throughout the courts of Europe. Henry VIII produced 3 surviving children who would all, in turn, occupy the English throne. Each of them carried Edmund Tudor's blood. Each of them cast shadows that Edmund could not have imagined. Mary Tudor, the daughter of Henry, and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, became the first queen regnant of England. She was 37 years old when she came to the throne in 1553, after the brief and unsuccessful attempt to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne instead. Mary was, in many ways, a tragic figure. She had spent much of her life in the shadow of her parents' divorce, being bastardized, being restored, being used as a political piece in negotiations with Spain. Watching her mother die estranged from the man she had loved, she came to the throne with an agenda that was clearly defined: to restore England to the Catholic faith. She reversed her father's Reformation. She re-established papal authority. She burned nearly 300 Protestants at the stake in the campaign of religious persecution that earned her the name Bloody Mary. Though those who apply that name without acknowledging the context of how Protestant England had treated Catholics in the preceding decades are telling only part of the story. Mary died in 1558 without children. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain had not produced the heir she had hoped for. She died having failed, in the most fundamental dynastic sense, at the central requirement of a monarch to produce a successor, and the throne passed to her younger half-sister, Elizabeth Tudor, the daughter of Henry VIII and his second wife Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Henry had broken with Rome, whom he had later executed on charges of adultery and treason, whose daughter was declared illegitimate, only to be restored to the succession by Henry's last wife, Catherine Parr. Elizabeth had spent her childhood in a state of permanent uncertainty, her mother dead, her legitimacy questioned, her position at court dependent on the shifting political winds of her father's court, and then of her half-siblings' reigns. She had survived. She had been careful and cautious and intelligent in the way that her grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, had been careful and cautious and intelligent, studying the world, reading its dangers, finding the path between them. She became queen in November 1558. She was 25 years old. She would reign for 44 years. She would become, in the reckoning of many historians and in the cultural memory of England, one of the greatest monarchs the country ever produced, not through military conquest, though the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was a genuine military triumph, but through the extraordinary combination of political intelligence, personal magnetism, and symbolic power that made the Elizabethan age one of the most creatively productive periods in English history. Shakespeare wrote his plays during Elizabeth's reign. Marlowe wrote his plays during Elizabeth's reign. The whole brilliant, turbulent, extraordinary flowering of English Renaissance culture, the poems and plays and explorations and innovations that still shape how we understand the English-speaking world, happened in the shadow of a woman who was Edmund, Tudor's great-granddaughter. She died on the 24th of March, 1603, having never married, having produced no children, having refused every pressure and every inducement to make the succession secure in the conventional way. The Tudor dynasty ended with her death. She was the last. The throne passed to James VI of Scotland, son of her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, who became James I of England and began the Stuart dynasty. The Tudor story, which had begun with Owen Tudor's arrival in an English royal household sometime around 1420, ended with Elizabeth's death in 1603. 180 years or so of living, 118 years from Bosworth to Elizabeth's death, 118 years of Tudor monarchy, built on the foundation of an impossible love, a secret marriage, and a child born 8 weeks after his father died in a cold Welsh castle. Let us return to Edmund himself now. Let us think about who he actually was, not as a symbol, not as a dynastic founder, not as the shadow behind a century of history, but as a person, a young man who lived for about 26 years and left very specific marks on the world around him. He was, from everything the historical record suggests, a man of genuine ability. The responsibilities he was given, the administration of his earldom, the role in Wales, the management of a household that included his young wife, and the network of relationships and obligations that came with his position required capability. He seems to have met those requirements. He was trusted by his half-brother Henry VI, which tells us something. Henry VI, whatever his other limitations, was apparently a good judge of personal character. He maintained loyal relationships with people who deserved his loyalty. Edmund seems to have been one of them. He was also a man shaped by loss from the very beginning of his life. His mother was gone when he was 6 or 7 years old. His father was in custody, then in a kind of semi-obscurity, then working his way back to a modest respectability present in Edmund's life, but not in the central, shaping way that a father present from birth would have been. Edmund grew up knowing that his existence was itself a kind of challenge to the established order, that his parents' love had been considered illegal, that his birth had been a complication for the world that surrounded him. Growing up with that knowledge, in the shelter of Barking Abbey, and then at the court of a half-brother who was trying to make it right, this must have produced a particular kind of character, perhaps a certain wariness, perhaps a particular appreciation for security and recognized standing, for the formal acknowledgement that the world was willing to extend to him when it finally came. He was Welsh. This mattered in ways that are easy to underestimate. He carried a Welsh heritage that connected him to a tradition and a people who had their own deep sense of identity. He was the son of Owen Tudor of Anglesey, and he knew it. His name, Edmund Tudor, was the anglicised form of a Welsh identity. When he went to Wales as the Earl of Richmond, he was going not simply as an English lord with Welsh territories, but as a man with genuine connections to the Welsh world. Welsh people noticed this. It mattered for how he was received and what he was able to accomplish. He was a man of his time. We need to say this clearly and honestly in the context of the most difficult aspect of his story, his marriage to the 12-year-old Margaret Beaufort, and the pregnancy that followed so quickly after that marriage. By the standards of modern ethics and modern understanding of child development and consent, this was wrong. Margaret was a child. The decision to marry her and to consummate that marriage was made by adults operating within a legal and social system that gave them complete authority over her, and they used that authority in ways that came close to killing her and that left permanent physical marks on her body. Edmund's responsibility for this cannot be minimized, even as we acknowledge that he was operating within the frameworks of his own era. What we can say, with somewhat more charity, is that there is no evidence Edmund was deliberately cruel to Margaret. The historical record does not paint him as a man who took pleasure in the control he had over her, or who treated her with contempt or carelessness. The marriage was arranged within the normal expectations of the wardship system. Whether Edmund thought carefully enough about Margaret's youth, about the risks of early pregnancy, about the power dynamics at play, we cannot know. We can only say that the consequences of his choices fell heavily on a 13-year-old girl who had no power to resist them. Margaret, in later life, does not appear to have expressed bitterness or condemnation toward Edmund's memory. She kept his memory, spoke of him with apparent respect, acknowledged him as Henry's father, worked to ensure that his son carried his heritage honorably. Whether this reflects genuine positive feeling or simply the pragmatic dignity of a woman who had learned to make peace with what she could not change, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that Edmund Tudor, in his brief life, managed to contribute to history in a way that far exceeded anything that could have been predicted from his beginnings. He was the secret son of a forbidden love. He became an earl. He served his king. He fathered a child who became a king. And the dynasty that child founded lasted for over 100 years and shaped the world we still inhabit through the Church of England, through the literature of the Elizabethan age, through the particular English sense of its own identity and destiny that the Tudor century helped to forge. Not bad for a boy who started his life as a shadow. Edmund Tudor was buried at the Church of the Grey Friars in Carmarthen after his death in November 1456. The Grey Friars was a Franciscan house, a place of prayer and scholarship, appropriate for the burial of a man of his rank. His body was laid there, in Welsh soil, in the church of a religious community in the town where he had died. There he rested for about 40 years, and then his son became king, and the king did not forget his father. And so we come to the end of Edmund Tudor's whispered story, a life that began with a secret love in a candlelit chamber and ended with a dynasty on the throne of England. A life so short in itself and so long in its consequences that it seems almost to strain the boundaries of what one person's brief time on earth can mean. He was 26 years old. He was married less than a year. He never knew his son. He died a prisoner in a castle of a disease that took no notice of earls or dynasties or the extraordinary weight of history that had already settled on his family's shoulders. And yet, without him, none of it, none of the great Tudor century, none of the Church of England, none of the Elizabethan age, none of Shakespeare's plays written for an Elizabethan audience, none of the strange, complicated, brilliant, terrible reality of Tudor England that shaped so much of what came after. Perhaps that is the deepest truth about shadow lives. They are not less real for being in the shadow. They are not less significant for being unacknowledged by the spotlight of history. The foundation of any building is underground, in the dark, where no one sees it, and without that foundation, nothing above ground stands. Edmund Tudor was the foundation. and the Tudor dynasty was the cathedral built above him, tall and glittering and visible for miles, for generations, for centuries. Thank you so much, dear friend, for walking through the shadows with me tonight here on Catherine. 4 long parts, a long and winding road through the 15th century. If this story touched you in any way, if Edmund's brief life felt real to you, if Margaret's determination moved you, if Owen Tudor's impossible love gave you something to think about in the quiet hours, I would be so deeply grateful for a like. It truly helps other lovers of forgotten history find us in the quiet corners of the internet, where stories like Edmund's are still being told. And please, drop a comment below. Do you think Edmund Tudor's Welsh heritage, his father's blood from Anglesey, his father's pride in that ancient lineage, was the secret heart of what made the Tudor dynasty feel different, feel like something genuinely new in the long history of English kingship? I read every single comment, and your thoughts matter more to me than I can easily say. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider joining our community of shadow history lovers here at KAVRIN. We have so many more forgotten stories waiting to be told, more whispered lives to explore, more people in the margins of the history books who deserve to have their whole story spoken aloud, slowly, in the candlelight where they lived. Sleep now, dear friend. Let the candle burn down to nothing. Let the shadows settle soft around you. Let the long, patient, extraordinary, heartbreaking shadow of Edmund Tudor rest in the peace it has earned, the peace of a life that mattered, that changed everything, that is remembered here, tonight, by us. Sleep well, and may Edmund's whispered story stay with you in your dreams, in the soft and shadowed places where the forgotten find their voice. Until next time, good night from Catherine.